Welcome to the Unveiled Epic channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery in the heart of America's Midwest, where the vast fields of golden corn stretch like an endless sea under the wide blue sky, and the winds whisper secrets from generations long past. There lies the small town of nestled in the rolling plains of Iowa, a place where time seems to move at the pace of the seasons, slow and deliberate, with folks who know every neighbor's name and every furrow in the earth. But beneath this serene facade simmers a tale so peculiar, so drawn out, that it spanned half a century, all revolving around a single scarecrow, that ragged figure of straw and old clothes, meant to ward off crows but instead becoming the epicenter of arguments, alliances, betrayals, and unearthed mysteries that reached back to ancient times, forgotten truths buried in the soil itself, waiting for the right souls to dig them up. Our story begins in the autumn of 1925. When the leaves turned fiery red and orange, painting the landscape in hues that made the heart ache with their beauty, and the air carried the crisp scent of harvest, it was then that old farmer Elias Hawthorne, a man with a face weathered like cracked leather from years under the sun, decided to erect a scarecrow in the middle of his cornfield. Not just any scarecrow, mind you, but one crafted with peculiar care, its arms outstretched as if embracing the horizon, its head tilted slightly toward the east. Where the sun rose each morning like a promise renewed, Elias had found an old burlap sack for its body, stuffed it with hay from last year's bale, and dressed it in a faded blue coat that once belonged to his grandfather, who had come over from Ireland during the Great Famine. But what made this scarecrow different was the stake it stood upon, a gnarled wooden post that Elias claimed he'd pulled from the depths of an ancient oak tree struck by lightning the previous spring. He planted it firmly in the soil at the crossroads of 4 fields, where his land met those of his neighbors, the Millers to the north, the to the south, the Wilkins to the west, and the open communal pasture to the east. And from that day forward, the arguments began, soft at first, like the murmur of a distant stream, but growing steadily into a torrent that would flood the town for decades. It started with Miller, a burly man with a beard as thick as a briar patch and a temper to match, who stormed over one crisp morning, his boots kicking up dust along the dirt path that connected their farms. "Elias," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the rustling cornstalks, "that scarecrow of yours is on my side of the line. It's scaring my chickens and casting a shadow over my pumpkins. Move it back 10 feet, or so help me I'll pull it up myself." But Elias, leaning on his pitchfork with a calm that belied the storm brewing, simply shook his head, saying, "Jade, that post is right where it needs to be. It's guarding the heart of the land, and besides, your fence has been creeping southward for years. If anything, it's on my property." And so the first skirmish was drawn, not with fists or firearms, but with words sharp as scythes, exchanged over cups of strong black coffee in Elias' kitchen, where the aroma of fresh-baked apple pie from his wife, oven tried in vain to sweeten the air. But the disagreement didn't end there, oh no. It spread like wildfire through dry grass, pulling in the who claimed the scarecrow's position was disrupting the natural flow of rainwater from their higher ground, causing puddles in their soybean rows, and the Wilkins, who argued it was an eyesore visible from their porch, ruining the view of the sunset that they cherished each evening as they rocked in their chairs, sipping lemonade laced with a touch of moonshine. Soon the whole community was involved. Gatherings at the town hall turned into heated debates. With maps unrolled on wooden tables, lines drawn in pencil and erased in frustration, voices rising and falling like the cadence of a summer storm. But amidst this squabbling, something peculiar began to emerge, whispers of an older story, one that Elias hinted at but never fully revealed, saying only that the scarecrow stood upon a spot of great significance, a place where ancient peoples had once gathered, perhaps the native tribes who roamed these plains before the settlers came, leaving behind arrowheads and pottery shards that farmers occasionally plowed up. But Elias spoke of more, of forgotten truths from even deeper in time, echoes of civilizations lost to history. And as the years rolled on, the argument evolved, no longer just about property lines, but about legacy and meaning, with each family adding layers to the saga. Like sediment building up in a riverbed, by 1930, the Great Depression had hit hard, dust bowls choking the air and hope alike. Yet the scarecrow remained, its coat frayed but defiant, and now the debates took on a superstitious tone, some saying it brought good luck, pointing to Elias' fields yielding better than others despite the drought, while Jade Miller grumbled that it was cursed, blaming it for his failed crops and the untimely death of his prize bull, which he swore had been frightened into a stampede by the Scarecrow's shadowy silhouette under a full moon. And then there was Young, a spirited girl with freckles like scattered stars and hair the color of ripe wheat, who at 16 began sneaking out at night to sit by the Scarecrow, confiding her dreams of leaving the farm for the big city. But one evening, as the stars twinkled overhead like diamonds on black velvet, she discovered something buried at its base, a small stone artifact, etched with symbols that looked like no language she knew, perhaps ancient runes or petroglyphs from a time when mammoths roamed the earth. Her heart pounded with excitement and a touch of fear as she pocketed it, showing it only to her best friend, Wilkins, a lanky boy with a keen mind for puzzles who, poring over dusty books in the town library, whispered that it might be linked to the mound builders, those mysterious prehistoric people who dotted the Midwest with earthen structures, hiding secrets of astronomy and ritual. And so the mystery deepened, pulling the youth into the fray, while the elders continued their endless arguments. Now laced with tales of ghosts and omens, like the night in 1935 when a tornado twisted through the fields, uprooting trees and barns but sparing the Scarecrow, which stood unmoved, its arms still outstretched as if commanding the winds to part, fueling beliefs that it was no ordinary guardian but a sentinel over something profound, perhaps a portal to forgotten truths. And as World War II called the young men away, including who enlisted with a heavy heart, leaving to tend the farm and guard the secret artifact, the arguments simmered but never ceased, letters from the front mentioning the Scarecrow as a symbol of home, a fixed point in a changing world. And upon their return in 1945, but alive, the debates reignited with renewed vigor, now involving surveys and lawyers from the county seat, who drew up documents that contradicted each other, lines shifting like sand dunes in the wind, but now married to and mother to 2 children. Began to unravel more of the mystery, digging carefully around the post on moonless nights, unearthing fragments of bone and bead, artifacts that spoke of rituals from ancient times, perhaps tied to the solstices, when the sun aligned with distant hills, and she confided in Elias, now an old man with eyes clouded by cataracts but mind sharp as ever, who revealed that his grandfather had told him stories passed down from the first settlers, of encountering native elders who warned against disturbing certain spots, places where the veil between worlds was thin, where echoes of the past could be heard in the rustling leaves. And so the saga stretched into the 1950s, with the post-war boom bringing tractors and electricity too, modernizing the farms but not quelling the old feud. Now the Scarecrow's position was debated at church picnics and county fairs, with pie-eating contests interrupted by pointed fingers and raised voices. And son, young Thomas, inherited the curiosity, finding in his grandmother's attic a journal from Elias' ancestor, yellowed pages detailing a discovery in 1875. When plowing the field, unearthed a stone tablet inscribed with symbols matching the artifact, hinting at a lost civilization that predated even the mounds, perhaps wanderers from across the Burring Land Bridge, carrying knowledge of stars and seasons, buried rituals to ensure bountiful harvests. And Thomas, with his college education in archaeology, began to connect the dots, realizing the Scarecrow stood atop what might be a sacred site, a geomagnetic anomaly or an alignment point for ancient observatories. But sharing this only sparked more arguments, with skeptics like Jade's grandson dismissing it as hogwash, while others saw it as a sign to preserve the land, tensions rising as developers from the city eyed the fields for expansion, threatening to bulldoze the spot. And in the 1960s, amid the turbulence of civil rights and Vietnam, the community split further, protests at town meetings turning rowdy, with signs reading "Move the Scarecrow and Protect Our Heritage." And a plot twist emerged when now Graying confessed to that during the war he'd had visions of the Scarecrow, guiding him home through enemy lines, as if it held a protective spirit tied to those ancient forgotten truths. And their daughter, a free spirit with flowers in her hair, delved deeper, consulting with university professors who carbon dated the artifacts to over 1,000 years old, revealing connections to the culture, traders of obsidian and copper, who built vast earthworks aligning with celestial events. And the mystery unfolded like a blooming flower, petal by petal, showing that the Scarecrow's spot was no accident but a deliberate placement by Elias' forebears, who had been entrusted with guarding it, a hidden story of stewardship passed down in whispers. But as the 1970s dawned, with oil crises and economic woes, the arguments reached a fever pitch, lawsuits filed and dismissed, families feuding at holidays, yet beneath it all, a sense of unity began to form as discoveries mounted, unearthing a small chamber beneath the post, containing relics that spoke of rituals involving corn gods and star maps, forgotten truths from influences perhaps trickling north, blending with local traditions, and Thomas's research led to a breakthrough. Decoding the symbols as a calendar predicting solar eclipses, one impending in 1980, which could bring either blessing or curse depending on the guardian's position, building tension as the date approached, neighbors reconciling tentatively to prepare. But betrayal struck when a greedy descendant leaked the findings to outsiders, inviting treasure hunters who sneaked in under cover of night, digging haphazardly and nearly destroying the site, only to be thwarted by vigilance, who alerted the community, leading to a climactic confrontation under a stormy sky, where lightning illuminated faces twisted in anger and fear. And in that moment, as rain poured down like tears from the heavens, the truth revealed itself fully. The Scarecrow not just a farm tool, but a modern echo of ancient sentinels, placed to mark a line of energy, connecting to global mysteries like Stonehenge or the Lines. A forgotten truth that this Midwest spot was a nexus of power, harnessed by ancients for fertility and foresight. And with the eclipse looming, the community united at last, repositioning the Scarecrow slightly to align perfectly, as per the decoded instructions. And as the moon shadowed the sun, a profound calm descended, crops flourishing miraculously thereafter, arguments fatting into fond memories, the saga resolving in harmony with the Scarecrow standing eternal, a symbol of perseverance and discovery, its story woven into the fabric of, passed down to future generations as a reminder that some mysteries are meant to endure, drawing us closer to the Earth's hidden heart. And yet, even as the eclipse passed and the fields burst forth with unprecedented bounty, the saga of the Scarecrow refused to truly end. For in the quiet aftermath, as the 1980s dawned with their neon glow and the hum of personal computers beginning to infiltrate even rural homes like those in, new generations stirred the pot once more, drawn by the allure of the hidden truths that lingered like mist over the morning dew, Thomas's. Now teenagers with Walkmans clipped to their belts and dreams fueled by MTV, stumbled upon digital archives in the nascent internet age. Though back then it was more dial-up modems screeching like banshees in the night, connecting them to university databases where scans of ancient manuscripts revealed parallels between the Midwest site's symbols and those found in European megalithic structures, suggesting perhaps transatlantic voyages long before Columbus. Forgotten explorers carrying seeds of knowledge across stormy seas, and this revelation sparked fresh arguments, not among the old families but with outsiders, archaeologists from distant cities who arrived in jeeps loaded with equipment, proposing to excavate the site fully, which divided the community anew, some seeing it as a chance for fame and tourism dollars to revitalize the aging town, others fearing it would disturb the spirits Elias had always spoken of. Those ancient guardians whose echoes could still be felt in the wind-swept corn, and now a grandmother herself with silver streaks in her once flowery hair, stood firm at town meetings, her voice steady as she recounted the visions her father had during the war, how the Scarecrow had appeared in his dreams, not as straw and cloth, but as a luminous figure etched in starlight, guiding him through foggy battlefields, a forgotten truth that this spot was a beacon for lost souls. Tied to lines that crisscrossed the globe like invisible threads, connecting to places of power from the pyramids of Egypt to the standing stones of Avebury. And as debates raged into the night under fluorescent lights in the community center, where coffee percolated endlessly and cookies crumbled under nervous fingers, a young historian named Miller, descendant of old, uncovered a hidden compartment in her family's attic, a dusty trunk containing letters from the 1800s. Yellowed missives between settlers and native intermediaries, detailing a pact made under a blood moon, where the land was ceded with the condition that certain markers, ancient wooden posts carved with runes, be preserved, and the Scarecrow's stake, she realized with a chill down her spine, was one such remnant, not from Elias' lightning-struck oak, but a far older relic, perhaps in the making, carbon-dated later to the Ice Age's end, when early peoples traversed the thawing plains, erecting totems to appease the gods of hunt and harvest. And this discovery twisted the plot further, bringing in federal agents from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who claimed jurisdiction over potential sacred sites, igniting legal battles that stretched through the years, with courtrooms filled with farmers in overalls testifying alongside experts in tweed jackets, arguments ebbing and flowing like the nearby Mississippi River, swelling with spring rains, and amid this, a mystery unfolded when strange lights were sighted over the field on clear nights, orbs dancing like fireflies out of season, captured on grainy camcorder footage by curious teens, fueling whispers of extraterrestrial connections, perhaps the ancient symbols serving as a landing guide for visitors from the stars. A forgotten truth blending indigenous lore with modern UFO myths, and partnering with Thomas's great-grandson. A tech-savvy youth named Liam, who coded algorithms to decode the runes further, revealed patterns matching constellation maps from Babylonian tablets, suggesting the site was an observatory for predicting cosmic events, like comets that once brought famine or fertility, building tension as a rare alignment of planets approached in 1990, rumored to activate the line's energy, potentially causing seismic shifts or bountiful miracles. But betrayal reared its head again when a Wilkins heir, tempted by a developer's bribe, attempted to sabotage the Scarecrow, sneaking out with a chainsaw under cover of darkness, only to be halted by a sudden storm that locals swore was summoned by the land itself, lightning cracking like whips, illuminating the figure standing sentinel, unchanged through decades, its coat now patched with fabrics from each family's heirlooms, a tapestry of the community's history, and in the climax of that stormy night, as winds howled and rain lashed the earth. The community gathered once more, lanterns swinging in the gale, forging a new alliance to protect the site, petitioning for historical landmark status, which was granted amid fanfare and fireworks on the 4th of July, 1995, exactly 70 years after Elias first planted the post, though the arguments had spanned a true half-century from 1925 to 1975, with echoes lingering beyond. Resolving in a profound peace where the Scarecrow became a symbol not of division, but of enduring mystery, its story a calming thread weaving through time, inviting all who listen to ponder the hidden depths beneath their feet, the forgotten truths that bind us to the ancients in an endless, soothing cycle of discovery and rest. As the new millennium approached with its Y2K fears and the buzz of the internet weaving its web across the globe, connecting even the remote farms to a world beyond the horizon, the Scarecrow's saga took on digital dimensions, with Liam's children now blogging about the site's mysteries on early websites, forums buzzing with amateur historians debating the rune's origins, linking them to Viking explorations up the great rivers or even Atlantean refugees in wild theories that danced across screens like fireflies in the dusk. And retired but ever vigilant, moderated these online discussions from her cozy kitchen, where the scent of baking bread mingled with the click-clack of her keyboard, ensuring the forgotten truths remained respected, not sensationalized. But fresh arguments erupted when a television crew arrived in 2000. Cameras rolling under the vast Iowa sky, proposing a documentary that would expose the site to millions, splitting the community between those eager for the spotlight, imagining bed and breakfast sprouting like mushrooms after rain, and those who feared commercialization would erode the sacredness, like water wearing away stone over eons. And amid the filming, a young archaeologist intern named, with eyes bright as polished agates and a passion for paleoanthropology, unearthed a fossilized amulet buried deeper than before, its surface etched with symbols mirroring those on Mayan stele, suggesting ancient trade routes snaking through the continent long before recorded history, a hidden story of migration and exchange that challenged textbooks, fueling academic debates that echoed through conferences and journals. And Liam, now a software engineer working remotely from the farm, used AI prototypes, crude by today's standards but revolutionary then, to model the lines, predicting energy surges during solar flares, which manifested as auroras visible unusually far south, painting the night sky in greens and purples that locals attributed to the Scarecrow's watchful gaze, building tension as climate change began to bite in the 2010s, with erratic weather patterns threatening crops, and some arguing to relocate the Scarecrow to higher ground to ward off floods, while others insisted its position was immutable, tied to geomagnetic constants that anchored the land's spirit. and betrayal struck once more when a distant relative, enticed by fracking companies eyeing the plains for oil, leaked coordinates online, inviting surveyors who probed the soil with machines humming like angry bees, only to retreat after equipment malfunctions blamed on unexplained interference, perhaps the ancient energies rebelling against intrusion, and in a climactic town hall meeting during a 2020 pandemic lockdown. Conducted via glitchy video calls with faces pixelated on screens, the community reaffirmed their bond, declaring the site a private preserve, funded by crowdfunding campaigns that drew supporters from around the world, enchanted by the endlessly drawn-out tale of unity forged from Discord. And as the 2020s unfolded with electric vehicles humming down country roads and drones surveying fields, the Scarecrow stood timeless, its form updated with solar-powered lights that glowed softly at night. A beacon for stargazers who gathered to witness meteor showers aligned with the rune's predictions, revealing forgotten truths of cosmic harmony, where the Midwest's humble plains held keys to understanding humanity's place in the universe. A soothing reminder that some arguments, like rivers carving canyons, shape us over time into something greater, deeper, more connected in the gentle flow of history's endless narrative. And now, as we glide into the year 2025, with the winter solstice casting long shadows over the snow-dusted fields of, where the cornstalks stand brittle and whispering under a blanket of frost, the Scarecrow's saga whispers onward, unbroken by time's relentless march. For in this December chill, on the eve of the holidays when families gather around hearths glowing with the soft light of string lights, and the aroma of cinnamon-spiced cider fills the air, a new generation awakens to the site's deeper enigmas, inspired by fresh discoveries echoing from across the Midwest, tales of Cahokia, that ancient megacity rising from the Illinois plains like a dream half-remembered, a bustling metropolis of earthen pyramids and wooden palisades, where tens of thousands once thrived in harmony with the stars and seasons, only to vanish mysteriously around 1350. Leaving behind mounds that still puzzle scholars with their astronomical alignments and ritualistic burials, and young Wilkins, a descendant with a tablet in hand and augmented reality glasses perched on his nose, begins overlaying digital reconstructions of those Mississippian wonders onto the landscape, revealing uncanny parallels, the Scarecrow's position mirroring a forgotten outpost. Perhaps a satellite settlement where traders from Cahokia exchanged flint tools and copper ornaments for the fertile Iowa soil's bounty, hidden stories of migration along the great rivers, the Mississippi carrying canoes laden with secrets from a civilization that rivaled the great cities of, and as shares his findings on social media streams, live from the field where the wind carries the faint scent of earth turned anew. Arguments flicker back to life in comment sections and virtual town halls. With elders like, now in her golden years with a voice as steady as the ancient oaks, cautioning against digging too deep, lest they disturb the spirits of those mound builders who crafted effigy mounds in the shapes of bears and birds across Wisconsin and Iowa. Vast earthen sculptures aligned with solstices, whispering forgotten truths of animistic beliefs where the land itself was alive, pulsing with energies that modern science glimpses through geomagnetic surveys, and amid this digital revival. A plot twist emerges when a drone survey, humming like a distant bee over the site, captures anomalies in the soil, thermal images revealing subterranean chambers not unlike those at Cahokia's Monk's Mound, the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, hinting at buried plazas where ceremonies once honored corn maidens and thunder beings. And Liam's granddaughter, a named Maya, returns from university excavations with pollen samples that date back to the woodland period. Over 2,000 years ago, pollen from exotic plants traded from the Gulf Coast, weaving a narrative of interconnected civilizations lost to time. But tension builds as climate activists, drawn by the site's resilience stories, propose relocating the Scarecrow to symbolize environmental stewardship, arguing that rising floodwaters from changing weather patterns threaten the low-lying fields, while traditionalists rally under starry nights, campfires crackling with the scent of burning hickory. Insisting the position is sacred, tied to the same celestial calendars that guided the people in Ohio, who built serpent mounds coiling like rivers of stone, predicting eclipses with eerie precision, and betrayal simmers when an anonymous tip, traced to a rival town's developer, leaks fabricated evidence suggesting the artifacts are modern forgeries. sparking online firestorms that divide friends and family, only for Maya to counter with DNA analysis from bone fragments, linking them to ancient lineages still present in native communities today. A revelation that fosters reconciliation, inviting tribal elders from the nearby settlement to share oral histories of the land's guardians, spirits that manifest as lights in the sky, much like the orbs sighted decades before, and in the climax of a community solstice gathering on December 21, 2025. As the sun dips low and the northern lights unusually grace the Midwest horizon in a dance of greens and violets, perhaps amplified by solar flares aligning with the rune's prophecies, the people unite in a ritual of renewal, reinforcing the scarecrow with sustainable materials, solar panels woven into its form to power a small museum pavilion, where virtual tour unveil the saga's layers, from Elia's first planting to the echoes of Cahokia's grandeur. Resolving once more in a tapestry of discovery, where arguments fade into shared wonder, the endlessly drawn-out tale becoming a lullaby for the soul, inviting all who hear it to drift into the peaceful embrace of history's hidden depths, where mysteries bloom eternal like the resilient prairie grass under the vast, star-studded sky. And yet, even as the echoes of that solstice ritual faded into the crisp winter air of late December 2025, with families returning to their homes adorned with twinkling lights and the gentle hush of snowfall blanketing the fields like a soft white quilt, the scarecrow's saga stirred once more, drawing in threads from Iowa's ancient past that had long slumbered beneath the soil. For in the quiet days following the gathering, young, poring over satellite imagery on his device while sipping hot cocoa by the fireside, noticed subtle contours in the land around the site, faint ridges and swells that modern plows had nearly erased, but which LiDAR scans, those laser-eyed surveys from above, revealed as remnants of effigy mounds, those enigmatic earthworks shaped like bears, birds, and serpents, crafted by the woodland peoples over a millennium ago, from around 500 BC to the cusp of the medieval era. Burial sites and ceremonial grounds where communities honored their ancestors and the spirits of the natural world. And this discovery, shared in a community newsletter emailed amid the holiday cheer, reignited debates not with rancor but with a shared sense of wonder. As elders recalled old tales of farmers unearthing arrowheads and pottery while tilling, now connecting them to these forgotten shapes in the earth. Perhaps the scarecrow unwittingly guarding a panther effigy or a soaring eagle mound. Symbols of protection and vision that aligned with the stars just as the runes had predicted. And Maya, collaborating with experts from the Effigy Mounds National Monument nearby in Harper's Ferry, where over 200 such structures dotted the bluffs along the Mississippi, brought in non-invasive tools like ground-penetrating radar, humming softly over the frost-kissed ground, unveiling hidden chambers without disturbing a single clod, revealing artifacts like shell beads and copper ornaments traded from distant shores, forgotten truths of a vast network that linked the Midwest to the Gulf Coast and beyond, where the Ho-Chunk people and their kin had once gathered under full moons to perform rituals that ensured harmony with the land. But tension whispered through the winds when rumors surfaced of past scandals, like the mysterious disappearance of thousands of sacred bones from the monument in the 1990s. A case unsolved that fueled whispers of hidden agendas and lost legacies, prompting some into question if their own site held similar vulnerabilities. And a plot twist unfolded when great niece, a budding journalist named, uncovered archived documents in the state library, yellowed reports from the 1930s detailing how an early archaeologist had mapped hundreds of mounds in northeast Iowa, drawing attention to their preservation amid the encroachment of farms and towns. Only for many to be plowed under in the name of progress, a forgotten truth that the community's endless arguments had inadvertently saved their spot from such a fate. And as arguments evolved into collaborative digs sanctioned by tribal councils, with permissions granted under starry skies during equinox camps, betrayal loomed in the form of online skeptics spreading misinformation about the mounds being mere natural formations, only to be countered by carbon-dated evidence and oral histories shared around bonfires, where elders spoke of the mounds as safe havens, places where the veil between worlds thinned, allowing glimpses of ancestral wisdom, building to a climax in the spring of 2026, as melting snow revealed fresh erosion threatening a nearby bird effigy, and the town, volunteers young and old forming human chains to shore up the earth with gentle hands. Planting native grasses that rooted deep like the saga itself, resolving in a newfound park designation, where the scarecrow stood as a modern totem amid the ancient forms, a bridge between eras that invited quiet reflection, its endlessly drawn-out tale a soothing melody of persistence and revelation, reminding all who wandered the paths that beneath the familiar fields lay layers of mystery, blooming eternal in the heart of the Midwest's timeless embrace. And as the summer sun of 2026 rose high over the newly dedicated preserve, casting golden light across the restored effigy mounds where prairie flowers bloomed in waves of purple coneflowers and yellow black-eyed Susans, swaying gently in the warm breeze that carried the sweet scent of wild grasses and distant rain, the scarecrow's enduring vigil invited even deeper explorations into the layered histories of the Iowa plains. 4. With her journalist's keen eye and a podcast microphone in hand, began interviewing descendants and visitors alike, capturing oral stories that wove personal memories with the ancient echoes, tales of great-grandparents who spoke of thunderbirds soaring in legends tied to the bird-shaped mounds, those massive earthen wings spanning hundreds of feet, symbols of upper-world messengers in the cosmologies of the Sioux and Winnebago peoples, guardians watching over the lower realms where serpents coiled in watery depths, and these recordings, shared on streaming platforms that reached ears far beyond, drew pilgrims of sorts, quiet seekers of heritage and mystery, who wandered the paths at dawn, their footsteps soft on the dew-kissed earth, pondering how such monumental works were built without wheels or metal tools, only the patient labor of baskets filled with soil. Carried one by one in communal effort that mirrored the town's own half-century of debates turned to unity, and Maya, delving further with her team, uncovered traces of astronomical alignments, the panther effigy perhaps pointing toward the rising of Sirius in ancient skis, the dog star heralding floods and fertility in echoes of Egyptian lore carried somehow across oceans of time, a forgotten truth suggesting shared human impulses to map the heavens from earthen canvases. Whether in the Nile Valley or the Mississippi Basin, but whispers of tension arose when funding proposals for signs and trails sparked discussions on interpretation, some favoring scientific plaques detailing carbon dates and pottery typologies from the late woodland era, around AD 500 to 1000, while others advocated for indigenous voices to lead, incorporating stories of creation where the earth diver brought up mud from primordial waters to form the land. And a subtle betrayal emerged in bureaucratic delays from state offices, tangled in red tape over repatriation laws like NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which mandated the return of cultural items to lineal descendants, prompting heartfelt consultations that stretched through autumn harvests, with combines rumbling in nearby fields as representatives from tribes gathered under pavilions, sharing tobacco ties and prayers that filled the air with sage smoke curling like gentle spirits, building to a climactic autumn equinox ceremony in September 2026, where the sun balanced day and night in perfect equilibrium, and the community, joined by visitors from afar, formed a circle around the scarecrow, its form now adorned with feathers and beads gifted in honor, voices rising in songs that blended old hymns with native drums, resolving lingering doubts in a profound sense of shared stewardship, the endlessly drawn-out saga evolving into a living legacy, where arguments dissolved into dialogues that nourished the soul like rain on parched soil, inviting all to rest in the knowledge that some places hold mysteries too vast for hasty unraveling, blooming slowly across centuries in the quiet heart of America's vast and whispering prairies. And with the autumn leaves of 2026 turning the preserve into a mosaic of crimson and gold, crunching softly underfoot as families strolled the newly marked trails where signs whispered of the effigy mound's ancient builders, the scarecrow's timeless presence drew in even more layers of the Midwest's veiled tapestry. For as winter approached once again in late 2026, with the first flurries dancing like fleeting memories on the wind, podcast episodes gained listeners from across the nation, voices tuning in during quiet evenings to hear the soothing cadence of stories about the culture that succeeded the effigy builders around AD 1300. A people who crafted intricate pottery decorated with trails of thunderbirds and water spirits, leaving behind village sites along the rivers where they farmed the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. In harmonious cycles that mirrored the community's own enduring debates turned to gentle guardianship, and inspired by virtual reality recreations shared online, designed an app that allowed users to point their phones at the landscape and see ghostly overlays of how the mounds might have appeared in their prime, towering forms alive with painted posts and feathered dancers under smoke from sacred fires. A digital bridge to forgotten truths where the land was seen not as property to divide, but as a living relative to honor. But subtle tensions arose in the crisp air when tourism gently increased, visitors leaving offerings of tobacco pouches at the Scarecrow's base, prompting discussions on sustainability, some advocating for limited access to preserve the fragile grasses that held the effigies intact, while others welcomed the sharing of heritage. Envisioning school buses bringing children to learn of the Red Horn myths, heroic cycles where twins battled underworld giants, echoes perhaps in the dual mounds that flanked the site like silent sentinels, and a gentle plot twist unfolded when Maya received a grant to analyze soil cores, revealing layers of charcoal from ancient hearths dating back to the Archaic period, over 8,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherers first gathered in seasonal camps. Napping flint tools and gathering wild rice from nearby wetlands, suggesting the spot's sanctity stretched deeper than imagined. A palimpsest of human presence where each era added its whisper without erasing the last. And as arguments flowed like meandering streams in spring council meetings held in the pavilion warmed by wood stoves crackling softly, betrayal appeared in minor form through miscommunications with grant overseers demanding more public access, only to be navigated with patience and shared meals of potluck casseroles and fresh apple pies, building toward a climactic winter solstice vigil in December 2026, where lanterns glowed along the paths and stories were shared under a canopy of stars remarkably clear, the Milky Way arching like a river of light overhead, and participants from tribal nations joined hands in a circle that encompassed the Scarecrow, its silhouette framed against the aurora's faint shimmer. Voices blending in quiet songs that honored the Earth's enduring breath, resolving once more in deepened bonds, the endlessly drawn-out saga unfolding like a slow-blooming perennial, its roots delving into the soothing depths of time where mysteries invite us to rest in wonder, cradled by the vast, whispering embrace of the ancient prairies under endless Midwestern skies. And as the winter solstice of 2026 passed into the quiet hush of early 2027, with the preserve blanketed in a deep, soft snow that muffled every sound and turned the world into a gentle dreamscape, where the effigy mounds slept beneath their white covers like ancient beings resting through the long, cold nights, the Scarecrow stood alone in the stillness, its form a dark silhouette against the pale expanse. Arms outstretched in eternal patience as faint winds whispered through the bare branches of distant oaks, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from far-off chimneys, where families nestled by firesides with mugs of warm milk and stories told in low, drowsy voices. And in this serene pause, continued to release her podcast episodes at a leisurely pace, each one unfolding slowly like the melting of icicles in the weak January sun. Delving into the quiet rhythms of the Paleo-Indian peoples who first wandered these glaciated plains over 12,000 years ago, hunters following mammoth trails across the vast tundra that once stretched where cornfields now sway, leaving behind fluted points of chert stone that occasionally surfaced in spring plows, silent witnesses to a time when the land was wild and untamed. And these tales, narrated in a voice as soft as falling snow, lulled listeners into peaceful reflection on how the site's sanctity might trace back to those earliest campfires, flickering under auroras that painted the Ice Age skis in colors we can only imagine. But no new arguments stirred in this season of rest, only a shared contentment as the community tended to indoor pursuits, quilting bees and book clubs where volumes on Midwest prehistory passed from hand to hand, pages turning slowly in the lamplight, and Maya stored her equipment away, allowing the ground to freeze undisturbed, honoring the natural cycle that demanded patience. Much like the half-century saga itself, which had taught generations that some truths reveal themselves only in the quiet waiting, the gentle passage of seasons without hurry or strife. And as February's full moon rose large and low over the horizon, casting a silvery glow that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds, visitors grew fewer, leaving the paths untouched save for the delicate prints of deer and rabbits meandering through the preserve. And Zack updated quietly with subtle enhancements, adding ambient sounds of wind and distant bird calls to immerse users in a meditative experience, encouraging long, slow breaths as they virtually wandered the mounds from the warmth of their homes. And in this extended calm, the Scarecrow seemed to embody the very essence of endurance without effort, standing through blizzards and thaws alike. Its patched coat heavy with frost that glistened in the morning light before dripping away in the mild afternoons. A rhythmic cycle as soothing as the steady tick of a grandfather clock in a quiet room, lulling the mind toward rest. And spring arrived late that year, with March winds still carrying flurries that danced lazily before settling. But when the first green shoots finally pushed through the softening earth, the preserve awakened in the gentlest way, wildflowers emerging one by one in no rush at all. And the community gathered for simple cleanups, picking up winter's fallen branches with unhurried movements, sharing thermos coffee and quiet conversations about nothing in particular. The saga's endless thread weaving onward in the most uneventful, comforting manner, like the slow turning of pages in a well-loved book read before bedtime, each chapter blending seamlessly into the next without climax or conflict, only the peaceful assurance that the land holds its secrets close, revealing them only to those who listen in stillness, drifting gradually into the deep, restorative embrace of sleep under the vast, star-filled Midwestern night. And as the gentle thaw of late spring 2027 finally settled over the preserve, with the snow melting into slow rivulets that trickled softly into the soil, nourishing the awakening roots of prairie grasses and the first tender leaves unfurling on the cottonwoods lining distant creeks, the Scarecrow remained a quiet fixture in the landscape, its form softened by the mild rains that fell in lazy drizzles, pattering on the earth like a lullaby, washing away the last traces of winter's grip in a rhythm as steady and unhurried as a heartbeat in deep repose. And the community moved through these days with the same leisurely pace, tending to gardens where tomato seedlings stretched toward the sun and radishes pushed up their green tops without any rush, while paused her podcast recordings to simply sit on her porch in the evenings, watching fireflies begin their slow dance in the twilight, their lights blinking on and off in a pattern that required no explanation or debate, just quiet observation. And Maya spent long afternoons cataloging artifacts in a sunlit room, sorting pottery shards by texture and color with deliberate care, each piece handled as if it held the weight of centuries, which it did, but without urgency, allowing the mind to wander through the vast emptiness of prehistoric time where days blurred into seasons and seasons into eras. And walked the trails alone sometimes, earbuds playing nothing at all, just the natural symphony of birdsong and wind rustling through his footsteps falling in a monotonous cadence that lulled the senses into a pleasant dullness, the effigy mounds rising and falling subtly underfoot like the gentle breathing of the earth itself, and no new discoveries pressed upon them in this extended interlude. No arguments flickered even in passing conversation, only the repetitive routines of rural life. Milking cows at dawn, mending fences in the warmth of midday, gathering for potluck suppers where dishes were passed in silence more often than not, conversations drifting to the weather or the price of corn before fatting into comfortable pauses filled with the clink of forks and the distant lowing of cattle. And summer crept in with its heavy, humid air that made movement slow and deliberate. Afternoons spent in rocking chairs on shaded porches with glasses of iced tea sweating gently. Condensation dripping like the slow passage of hours, while the Scarecrow stood through it all, its straw filling settling imperceptibly over time, its coat fatting further under the relentless but soft sun, a presence so constant it became invisible in its familiarity, like the horizon itself or the endless cycle of planting and harvest that defined the days without fanfare or conflict. And as autumn returned once more in 2027, with leaves turning in their predictable palette of amber and rust, falling one by one to carpet the paths in a cushioned layer that muffled footsteps even more, the preserve saw fewer visitors still, leaving it to the locals who knew its contours by heart, walking the same loops day after day in a routine as soothing as the turning of prayer beads. Thoughts emptying gradually until only the sensation of cool air on skin and the faint scent of decaying leaves remained, inviting a profound stillness where the saga's endless thread seemed to pause, not in resolution but in suspension, a long, drawn-out breath held in the quiet heart of the Midwest, where time stretched thin and transparent, allowing the mind to drift downward into layers of rest, deeper and deeper, until the world above faded entirely into the soft, enveloping darkness of uninterrupted sleep. And as the winter of 2027-2028 settled in once more over the preserve, with December's short days drawing the curtains early on the world outside, leaving long evenings filled with the soft glow of lamps and the occasional creak of old houses settling into the cold, the Scarecrow endured in its familiar spot, frost rimming its edges each morning only to melt away by midday in weak sunbeams that filtered through bare branches. A cycle so repetitive and uneventful that it blended into the background like the distant hum of a refrigerator in a quiet kitchen, unnoticed yet ever present, and the community slipped into its winter rhythms without disturbance, snowplows rumbling slowly down country roads in the pre-dawn hours, leaving neat paths that filled again by evening, while inside homes the sense of simmering soups and baking bread wafted through rooms where people moved languidly, wrapping in blankets to read or knit or simply stare out windows at the unchanging white landscape. And podcast remained on hiatus through these months, no new episodes pressing to be recorded, allowing the stories to rest just as the land did, buried under layers of snow that insulated everything in a profound hush, broken only by the occasional call of a crow circling overhead or the soft thud of snow sliding from a roof. And Maya organized her notes in a methodical, unhurried way, stacking papers and labeling drawers with the patience of someone who knows that ancient histories reveal themselves not in flashes, but in the slow accumulation of details over years, decades even, much like the sediment building the mounds themselves, layer upon imperceptible layer, and spent hours indoors tweaking minor details in his app, adjusting the volume of virtual wind sounds to be even softer, more conducive to meditation. Testing it himself on quiet afternoons when the house was empty, lying back with eyes closed as the simulated prairie breeze played through his headphones, lulling him into naps that stretched longer than intended, and no visitors braved the drifted paths in any numbers, leaving the preserve to its solitude where animal tracks crisscrossed the snow in lazy patterns, deer browsing on bark, rabbits hopping in aimless loops, foxes trotting straight and purposeful before vanishing into the woods. All under the watchful but indifferent gaze of the Scarecrow, its form gradually buried up to the knees in drifts that piled and subsided with each passing storm, a process so gradual it went unmarked day to day, week to week, and town gatherings were sparse, perhaps a card game here or a church supper there, conversations meandering through the same familiar topics, the depth of the snowpack, predictions for spring planting, recollections of winters past that were always harsher or milder depending on who was speaking, voices low and drawn out, pauses lengthening as full bellies and warm rooms encouraged drowsiness, heads nodding gradually until someone excused themselves to head home through the crisp night air that bit gently at cheeks before the car heater warmed everything into a cocoon of comfort. And through January and into February, the days lengthened by mere minutes, imperceptible at first, but enough to hint at the turning of the great wheel, though no one hurried toward it, content in the repetitive chores of feeding livestock, splitting firewood with rhythmic swings that tired the body pleasantly, shoveling walks in short bursts followed by long rests with coffee steaming in mugs held in gloved hands. And the Scarecrow, half forgotten in its seasonal camouflage, stood as it always had, neither advancing nor retreating the saga, which by now had stretched so thin and transparent that it became less a story than a state of being, an endless, uneventful continuity like the slow drift of continents or the gradual erosion of riverbanks, soothing in its utter lack of drama, inviting the mind to release all tension and simply float in the vast, quiet expanse where nothing demanded attention, nothing stirred conflict, only the gentle, monotonous flow of time carrying everything downward into deeper and deeper layers of calm, until awareness softened entirely, and dissolved into the profound, dreamless embrace of sleep. And as the slow creep of March 2028 finally began to soften the edges of winter, with occasional thaws turning the snow into a heavy, sodden blanket that sank gradually into the earth, revealing patches of mud and the first hints of dormant grass beneath. The preserve lay in that in-between state where nothing hurried and everything waited with infinite patience. The scarecrow's form emerging bit by bit from its snowy shroud as drifts melted in uneven patches. Water dripping steadily from its outstretched arms in a monotonous rhythm that could lull a watcher into a stupor if they stared too long. And the days stretched with the same unvarying pattern. Mornings of gray skis giving way to pale sunshine that warmed nothing dramatically. Afternoons of chores done at half speed because the mud sucked at boots and made every step an effort best taken slowly. Evenings drawing in early still with suppers of hearty stews eaten in silence around kitchen tables lit by soft bulbs that cast long shadows across wallpaper, faded from years of the same light falling in the same places, and resumed her walks along the plowed roads, but without urgency, pausing often to lean on fence posts and gaze at nothing in particular, her mind emptying of podcast scripts or historical queries, content to let the quiet seep in like the meltwater into the soil. And Maya sorted through seed catalogs instead of artifacts for a change, planning a small garden plot with varieties of heirloom corn that might echo the ancient strains once cultivated here, turning pages languidly while the kettle hummed on the stove, steam rising in lazy curls that fogged the windows and blurred the view outside, and left his devices charging untouched for days at a time. Preferring the simple repetition of feeding the chickens or stacking firewood in neat rows that would be depleted just as neatly come next winter. Movements repetitive and soothing, each log placed with the same care as the last, thoughts drifting away on the crisp air scented with pine sap and distant manure. And the community as a whole seemed to exhale into this prolonged limbo. Gatherings postponed not out of conflict, but because no one felt the need to convene when everything was proceeding exactly as it always had, snow turning to slush, turning to mud, turning to dust in due course, the effigy mounds remaining unaltered beneath it all, their shapes softened by time and weather, but enduring in their subtle rises and falls that only the most attentive eye could discern after years of familiarity, and spring planting began late that year. Tractors moving at a crawl through fields still too wet in spots, leaving deep ruts that would dry into hard furrows. Seeds dropped one by one into the cool earth with mechanical precision, but no haste. Farmers pausing often to straighten backs and scan the horizon where clouds built and dispersed without delivering rain or drama. Just the endless cycle of preparation without expectation, and summer arrived in fits and starts. Heat building gradually until the air shimmered over the roads and cicadas began their monotonous drone from dawn to dusk. A sound so constant it became silence in its own way, lulling porch sitters into dozes that lasted hours, heads nodding forward until chins rested on chests, breaths deepening in the heavy humidity, and the scarecrow, fully revealed now with its coat sun-bleached to an even paler shade, stood through the long hot days as crows wheeled overhead in lazy circles, occasionally landing nearby, but never troubling the crops that grew tall and green in orderly rows. Everything proceeding with the predictability of clockwork wound down to its slowest setting, where minutes felt like hours and hours like days, inviting the mind to unclench entirely, to release all grip on narrative or novelty, sinking instead into the vast, featureless expanse of rural continuity where the saga stretched thinner than ever. A single thread drawn out across centuries without knot or tangle, only the gentle, insistent pull toward deeper rest, where eyelids grew heavy and thoughts dissolved like mist in morning sun, carrying everything downward into the soft, boundless depths of uninterrupted, dreamless sleep that enveloped the whole quiet world under the slow-turning Midwestern sky. And as the languid heat of August 2028 enveloped the preserve in a hazy veil, with the sun hanging high and unmoving for hours on end, casting long shadows that shifted imperceptibly across the effigy mounds where the grasses had grown tall and golden, swaying in the faintest breezes that offered no real relief from the humidity clinging to everything like a heavy blanket. The scarecrow persisted in its unchanging pose, its straw-stuffed body absorbing the warmth without complaint. its faded coat fluttering ever so slightly in the occasional puff of wind that carried the distant drone of combines harvesting wheat in neighboring fields. A sound so steady and repetitive it blended into the fabric of the day, unnoticed after the first few minutes, and the community moved through these dog days with exaggerated slowness, rising late after nights spent on screen porches listening to crickets chirp in endless monotony, breakfasts of cold cereal or leftover pie eaten without conversation, afternoons reserved for the barest essentials like checking livestock water tanks or pulling a few weeds from flower beds before retreating indoors to the hum of fans pushing warm air around in circles, curtains drawn against the glare, and left her recording equipment untouched on the shelf, gathering a fine layer of dust that she wiped away only when the mood struck, which was rarely, preferring instead to sit in the shade with a glass of lemonade melting ice cubes one by one. Watching clouds drift in shapes that changed so gradually they might as well have been still, and Maya pored over the same field notes from seasons past, reading paragraphs repeatedly until the words lost meaning and became mere patterns on the page, her eyes growing heavy in the dim study where the clock ticked with deliberate slowness, each second stretching into the next without distinction, and wandered the trails less frequently now, the heat sapping ambition. Content to lie in a hammock strung between two maples, staring up at leaves that rustled in the barest whisper, their green filtered light dappling his face in a pattern that repeated hour after hour, lulling him into shallow dozes interrupted only by the occasional bird call echoing faintly before fatting back into silence. And town life mirrored this torpor. Stores closing early with signs apologizing for the inconvenience, but no one minding much. Roads empty save for the occasional pickup rumbling past at reduced speed to avoid kicking up dust that hung suspended in the still air. Gatherings limited to brief nods across fences or waves from tractors. Words conserved like water in a drought. And the Scarecrow, central yet peripheral, marked the passage of these interminable days without fanfare. Crows perching on its arms briefly before flying off again, leaving it to its solitary watch over fields that ripened in unhurried increments. Ears of corn filling out kernel by kernel, soybeans podding in silence, everything proceeding at nature's own drowsy pace that invited human observers to match it, to slow breaths and heartbeats until the boundary between wakefulness and rest blurred entirely, thoughts thinning out like morning fog under a relentless sun, dissipating gradually until nothing remained but the vast, empty expanse of summertime stillness, where the saga's thread had stretched to its most attenuated. A faint vibration in the air like the hum of distant insects, carrying the mind downward through layers of deepening calm, heavier eyelids, softer limbs, until the world receded entirely into the welcoming void of profound, unbroken sleep that stretched as endlessly as the flat Midwestern horizon under the unchanging blue sky. And as September 2028 eased into the preserve with cooler nights that brought the first hints of frost glittering on the pumpkin vines in the early mornings, when the air carried the faint, sweet decay of fallen leaves and the distant lowing of cattle settling into barns for the evening, the Scarecrow stood through the gradual shortening of days, its silhouette lengthening across the drying grasses in the low-angled sunlight that filtered through thinning clouds. A presence so ingrained in the landscape that it required no notice, no discussion, blending seamlessly with the horizon like the silos dotting the distant farms, or the power lines sagging gently between poles weathered gray by countless seasons of rain and wind and sun. And the community drifted into autumn routines with the same measured pace, harvests proceeding in unhurried waves as combines moved field by field, their engines droning in low, constant hums that echoed across the flats from dawn until dusk. Pausing only for refueling or minor repairs that were handled without fuss, grain bins filling steadily with golden kernels that poured in steady streams, dust rising in lazy clouds that settled just as slowly, and occasionally jotted notes in a journal left open on the kitchen table, but more often left it untouched, preferring to watch the geese flying south in ragged V formations high overhead, their calls fading into the vast blue until silence returned, unbroken and comforting. And Maya harvested her small plot of heirloom corn, ears picked one by one and laid in baskets to dry on the porch in the mild afternoons, husks peeling back gradually to reveal rows of multicolored kernels that gleamed dully in the light, a task done in short sessions interspersed with long rests in a lawn chair. Eyes half closed against the glare, mind wandering nowhere in particular, and helped with the hay baling when asked. Riding on the wagon as bales were stacked in neat rows that would be stored away for winter feeding. The repetitive motion of lifting and placing lulling the body into a pleasant fatigue that made evenings melt into early bedtimes under heavy quilts that smelled of line-dried freshness. And gatherings were minimal, perhaps a brief stop at the co-op for supplies where nods and murmured hellos sufficed. Or a Sunday drive to church followed by coffee in the basement hall where conversations lingered on the same topics repeated from years prior. The yield this season, the chance of early frost, memories of harvests long past that blurred together in comfortable sameness, voices low and drawn out, pauses filled with the sip of coffee or the creak of folding chairs, no one rushing to leave or arrive, and the effigy mounds now outlined more clearly by the shorter grasses trampled by deer paths. Lay quiet under the changing light, their ancient forms undisturbed by plows or feet beyond the worn trails, holding their secrets in the soil with the patience of stone. And the scarecrow marked the turning leaves without comment, its arms still outstretched, as if embracing the slow chill creeping in, coat patches holding firm against the occasional gust that sent leaves swirling in eddies around its base before they settled again in drifts that built imperceptibly day by day. And through October the nights grew longer. Stars emerging earlier in skies cleared by cold fronts that passed without storm, only bringing crisp air that made breaths visible in the moonlight. Porch lights left on low for no particular reason, illuminating empty drives where cars sat parked until morning, and everything proceeded in this extended, uneventful flow. The saga's thread so fine now it was barely perceptible, a faint hum beneath the surface of daily life like the distant train whistle that sounded at the same times each day. Familiar and ignored, carrying the mind along on its monotonous track toward deeper relaxation, muscles loosening one by one, thoughts slowing to a trickle, until the weight of eyelids became irresistible, pulling downward into the soft, all-encompassing darkness of deep, restorative sleep that wrapped the quiet world in its gentle, unending hold under the vast and indifferent Midwestern stars. And as November 2028 drew its gray curtain across the preserve, with days shortening further until twilight lingered only briefly after the sun dipped below the flat line of the horizon, leaving the sky a deepening bruise of purple and indigo before full night claimed it all. The scarecrow stood motionless in the gathering chill, its form etched against the pale glow of early moonrise that cast long, pale shadows across the frost-kissed grasses. Shadows that stretched and merged until they became one with the dark, and the community moved through these final weeks of the year in a familiar, almost mechanical hush. Wood stoves stoked with logs split the previous winter, smoke rising in slow, straight columns that hung in the still air like faint memories, and suppers were simple. Potatoes roasted in their jackets, thick slices of bread with butter that melted slowly. Bowls of stew simmered all afternoon until the house filled with the quiet scent of thyme and onion, eaten at tables where chairs were pulled close to the warmth. Conversation limited to murmurs about the weather forecast or the need to check the furnace filter. Words trailing off into comfortable silence broken only by the tick of a wall clock or the occasional pop of burning wood, and kept the porch light on low each evening, its soft yellow glow illuminating nothing more than the empty yard and the distant outline of the barn, a beacon for no one in particular but left burning anyway, habit as much as purpose. And Maya spent hours in the quiet of her living room sorting through old photographs, black and white images of grandparents standing beside plows or posing with baskets of corn, faces blurred by time and the slow fade of paper. Each photo studied at length before being placed carefully back into albums that smelled faintly of cedar and dust, her fingers moving with deliberate slowness, the process stretching across weeks without hurry, and took to walking the preserve in the late afternoons when the light was flat and gray, boots crunching faintly on the frozen ground, breath clouding in front of him in regular puffs that matched the slow rhythm of his steps, passing the scarecrow without pause, simply acknowledging its presence with a nod that required no more thought than breathing, and the effigy mounds lay under a thin veneer of frost that sparkled faintly when the moon was high, their shapes barely discernible in the dimness, ancient and patient, holding the same silence they had for centuries, undisturbed by the occasional passing of a deer or the soft tread of a fox, and town life wound down further, stores closing by 4 on weekdays. Streets empty after dusk, except for the occasional pickup heading home with headlights cutting through the fog that rolled in from the river bottoms, headlights that swept across fields in slow arcs before vanishing into the night. And evenings were spent in front of flickering television screens, tuned to old movies or nature documentaries where narrators spoke in low, even tones about glaciers retreating or birds migrating. Voices blending with the hum of the furnace until eyelids grew heavy and heads nodded forward, bodies sinking deeper into recliners or sofas. And the Scarecrow, ever present, endured the first hard freezes of the season without shift or complaint, its coat stiffening in the cold, straw inside contracting slightly, arms still outstretched as if welcoming the quiet that settled over everything like a heavy quilt, and through the long nights of late November, when the wind sometimes rose just enough to rattle loose shutters or sigh through bare branches, the saga of the Scarecrow remained a faint undercurrent, no longer a story that demanded telling but a simple fact of existence, as unchanging as the cycle of seasons or the turning of the earth itself, carrying no drama, no revelation, only the gentle, repetitive flow of time that invited the mind to release all effort, to let go of thought and memory, sinking gradually through layers of warmth and stillness until the boundary between awake and asleep dissolved entirely, leaving only the soft, enveloping darkness of deep, unbroken rest that cradled the entire quiet world under the endless Midwestern night sky. And as December 2028 deepened into its shortest days, with the sun barely cresting the horizon before beginning its slow descent again, leaving the preserve bathed in a perpetual twilight of pale grays and muted blues that blended seamlessly from dawn to dusk without sharp edges or dramatic shifts, the Scarecrow remained rooted in place, its form a faint outline against the overcast skies that hung low and heavy, shedding occasional flurries that melted on contact with the ground or accumulated in thin, uneven layers that crunched softly underfoot before compacting into ice by morning, a process repeated day after day with no variation worth noting, and the community nestled deeper into winter's embrace, homes buttoned up tight with storm windows latched and drafts sealed with rags tucked along sills, furnaces humming in basements at a constant low rumble that vibrated faintly through floors and walls. A sound so steady it became inaudible after the first few minutes, blending with the silence of snow-muffled outdoors, and meals were prepared in the same order each week. Oatmeal mornings with raisins plumped slowly in the pot, midday sandwiches of cheese and bread toasted under the broiler until just warm, evenings of casseroles baked at low heat for hours, until flavors melded into something indistinct and comforting. Eaten from the same plates washed and dried and stacked in the same cupboards night after night, and left her journal closed on the side table, pages unmarked for weeks, content to gaze out the frosted window at the unchanging view of bare trees and empty fields, where nothing moved except the occasional swirl of snow lifted by a gust too weak to rattle the panes. And Maya rearranged her artifact shelves only to return each item to its original spot after brief consideration. The dust settling back in the same patterns, her movements languid in the dry indoor heat that made skin itch faintly and eyes grow tired from staring at the same corners of the room hour after hour, and passed the days in minor repairs around the house, tightening a loose doorknob that didn't really need it, oiling hinges that squeaked only occasionally. Tasks stretched across entire afternoons with long pauses for coffee refills that cooled untouched on the counter, steam rising and dissipating in lazy curls. And outdoor chores were minimal, paths shoveled in short sessions that left breath heaving invisible clouds before retreating inside to thaw fingers around mugs of cocoa that tasted the same every time, marshmallows melting into white swirls that dissolved without trace, and evenings stretched long in front of televisions tuned to channels showing reruns of old sitcoms or weather reports predicting more of the same. Cloudy, cold, chance of flurries. Announcers' voices droning in even tones that required no attention, images flickering softly in the dim rooms where lamps were left on low, casting pools of light on worn carpets trod in the same paths year after year. And sleep came early and often, naps in armchairs after lunch lasting until supper, heads lolling to one side with mouths slightly open, breaths deep and regular, waking only to shift position and drift off again without fully surfacing, and the Scarecrow, half buried once more in accumulating snow that piled gently around its base, stood through it all without the slightest alteration, its presence as unremarkable as the frost patterns etching the windows or the slow drip from icicles hanging from eaves, melting drop by drop in the weak midday sun only to refreeze by night. And through the quiet weeks leading into the new year, nothing disturbed the monotonous flow. No visitors, no events, no shifts in routine. Only the endless repetition of small actions and long inactions that blurred the days together into one extended, featureless expanse, where thoughts slowed to a standstill and awareness softened at the edges, eyelids growing heavier with each passing hour, the weight of routine pressing gently downward until the mind surrendered entirely, slipping effortlessly into the deep, enveloping layers of uninterrupted sleep that held everything in its soft, unchanging grasp under the vast, indifferent blanket of Midwestern winter night. And as the quiet weeks of January 2029 unfolded under persistently overcast skies that diffused the weak sunlight into a uniform gray glow stretching from horizon to horizon, with temperatures hovering just above or below freezing in increments too small to notice, without checking the thermometer that hung outside the kitchen window and was glanced at only occasionally, the preserve remained wrapped in its winter dormancy. The effigy mounds buried under a compacted layer of snow that had crusted over from repeated melts and refreezes, forming a hard shell that bore the weight of wandering deer without breaking through, their hooves leaving shallow impressions that filled with blown snow almost as quickly as they were made. And the Scarecrow protruded only partially now, its upper torso and head visible above the drifts that had piled unevenly around its post. Snow clinging to the folds of its coat in clumps that thawed slightly on warmer days only to harden again by night, a cycle so predictable and minor it warranted no comment even in passing thoughts. And daily life in the community proceeded with the same understated repetition, mornings beginning with the slow ritual of brewing coffee that percolated in the same pot used for decades, the aroma filling kitchens in a familiar wave that prompted yawns more than alertness. Breakfasts of toast spread with jam from jars put up the previous summer, eaten while staring at the same calendars turned to January pages illustrated with generic snow scenes that looked nothing like the actual view outside, and chores were spaced far apart, feeding the furnace with coal or wood in measured scoops, checking water pipes for freezes that never quite materialized this mild winter, brushing snow from porches in desultory sweeps that left patches untouched because no one was expected to visit anyway, and afternoons dissolved into long stretches of sitting by windows with books open on laps, but pages unturned for hours, or standing at sinks washing the same few dishes multiple times, because the warm water felt good on chilled hands, suds forming and popping in slow motion under the faucet's steady drip, adjusted to its usual trickle, and occasionally flipped through seed catalogs that arrived in the mail, marking nothing, simply tracing pictures of flowers and vegetables with a finger that moved languidly across glossy pages, the paper rustling faintly in the quiet room heated just enough to keep pipes from bursting, and Maya labeled storage boxes with contents already known by heart, writing in block letters that took minutes per label because the pen paused often, ink drying slightly before continuing. The task extending across days that blended without markers and repaired nothing in particular, instead whittling small sticks into even smaller shavings that piled on the newspaper spread across the table, curls of wood falling one by one in a rhythm as monotonous as a metronome set to its slowest tempo, shavings swept into the stove later to burn with brief pops that disturbed the silence only momentarily, and evenings came early with suppers reheated from midday leftovers. Portions small because appetites matched the lethargy of the season, eaten in front of windows darkening gradually, until lights were switched on with flips that echoed slightly in empty rooms, televisions murmuring at low volume with programs watched half-heartedly, images of faraway places or fictional dramas registering only peripherally as eyes glazed over, and heads tilted back against cushions worn soft from years of the same pressure. Breaths deepening incrementally until snores mingled with the program audio in a duet of drowsiness, and nights stretched long under heavy blankets that trapped body heat in pockets of warmth, waking only to shift positions or pad to bathrooms down halls chilled despite closed doors. Floors creaking in the same spots trod nightly for decades, returning to beds that welcomed back with familiar dips and the faint scent of laundry soap unchanged since childhood, and through February the pattern held firm. Groundhog predictions ignored because shadows or sun made no practical difference to routines locked in stasis. Valentines exchanged only in obligatory cards to far away, mailed with stamps licked slowly and envelopes sealed with presses that left faint fingerprints in the glue. And the scarecrow, increasingly buried as occasional snows added layers, became less a figure than a suggestion of shape beneath the white. Its role in any saga reduced to mere endurance without witness or purpose beyond existing through the interminable cold. And everything conspired in this extended hibernation to loosen the grip of consciousness. Days bleeding into weeks without incident or interest. Thoughts circling the same trivial orbits until they slowed and stilled entirely. The weight of sameness pressing gently but insistently downward, eyelids drooping further with each blink prolonged. Breaths lengthening into sighs that carried the last remnants of wakefulness away, dissolving into the profound, all-absorbing depths of sleep that enveloped body and mind in layer after layer of soft, featureless oblivion, stretching as endlessly as the flat, snow-covered fields under the vast, unvarying Midwestern winter sky. And as the lingering haze of February 2029 gave way to the even slower thaw of March, with days marked only by the gradual lengthening of twilight that crept in almost imperceptibly, adding mere minutes of pale light at the edges of the long nights where the preserve lay under a thinning blanket of snow that had turned granular and dirty from wind-blown dust, and the occasional exhaust from passing plows on distant roads, the scarecrow emerged further from its winter burial. Inch by inch as the sun's arc rose higher, but warmed little, melting the surface just enough to create a crust that held mornings and collapsed into slush by afternoon. A daily transformation so minor and repetitive it passed without remark or even conscious notice. And the community continued in its deeply ingrained hibernation, waking later each morning, as alarm clocks were ignored in favor of the natural dimness that filtered through curtains left drawn for days. Breakfasts delayed until hunger finally stirred bodies from warm beds that retained the shape of sleepers long after rising. Coffee brewed weaker than usual because measuring spoons were used less precisely in the groggy haze, sipped in slow gulps from mugs cradled in laps while sitting in the same chairs facing the same windows, overlooking the same unchanging fields where nothing stirred beyond the occasional crow landing and departing with indifferent flaps, and chores dwindled to the absolute minimum. Furnace checks reduced to glances at thermostats that held steady without intervention. Mail retrieved from boxes only every few days because bills and catalogs accumulated without urgency. Floors swept in half-hearted passes that left corners untouched because no one walked there anyway. Anne's journal remained closed beside her reading glasses on the nightstand, gathering a faint film of dust that matched the frost still lingering on the insides of storm windows. Her days filled with the quiet turning of pages in novels, reread so many times the plots unfolded in memory before the eyes reached the words. Sentences scanned lazily until the book slipped from loosening fingers and rested open on her chest during unplanned naps that stretched from mid-morning into the lunch hour skipped entirely, and my assorted seeds saved from last year's garden, spilling them onto newspaper in small piles, counted and recounted with fingers that moved sluggishly in the dry air. Packets resealed and stored in tins that clinked softly when shaken, but were left still most of the time. The task abandoned midway through for long stares at the ceiling where cracks formed familiar patterns studied like clouds in summer, but without the energy to imagine shapes, and passed hours in the barn reorganizing tools that were already in order, hanging hammers and wrenches on pegboards in the same configurations, rearranged only slightly before being returned to original spots. The metallic clinks echoing faintly in the cold space, filled with the scent of old hay and machine oil that hadn't changed in years. Movements slowing until he simply sat on an overturned bucket watching dust motes drift in shafts of light from cracked boards. Time passing unmarked by clocks left unwound, and evenings blended into nights without clear division. Suppers of soup heated from cans poured into the same bowls night after night, flavors indistinguishable after so many repetitions. eaten spoonful by spoonful with pauses lengthening until the spoon rested untouched, and eyes closed briefly only to remain shut. Bodies slumping sideways on couches where Afghans crocheted decades ago were pulled up to chins. Breaths deepening into the slow cadence of near sleep, interrupted only by the need to shift for comfort before sinking further. Televisions left on with volumes low enough that dialogue became a murmur indistinguishable from the furnace hum or the wind pressing gently against siding. Images flickering unnoticed across closed eyelids. And through the long, featureless weeks of early spring, the pattern deepened into an almost trance-like stillness. Outdoor air still sharp enough to discourage lingering walks. Indoor air heavy with the staleness of sealed houses, where windows remained closed against the chill that seeped in anyway. And the scarecrow, now fully exposed again with snow receded to patches in shaded dips, stood in its perpetual vigil without the slightest sway or alteration, coat hanging limp in the calm. Straw inside settled into permanent compression from seasons of weight and weather, a fixture as unchanging as the soil it was anchored in. Its saga reduced to the faintest whisper beneath layers of routine so thick they muffled even memory, days dissolving into one another without boundaries or highlights. Thoughts circling slower and slower until they ceased altogether, the mind emptying gradually like a basin draining drop by drop, eyelids weighing heavier with each passing moment, breaths lengthening into sighs that carried away the last vestiges of awareness, pulling everything downward through endless strata of softening darkness into the deepest, most profound levels of sleep where nothing disturbed the vast, enveloping quiet that mirrored the endless flatness of the snow-fatting fields under the immense, indifferent canopy of the Midwestern sky, stretching boundlessly in every direction. And as the soft gray light of late March 2029 finally began to linger a little longer each afternoon, though still too weak to melt the last stubborn patches of snow hiding in the north-facing dips around the effigy mounds where the earth stayed cold and unyielding beneath, the scarecrow stood revealed once more in its full, quiet dignity, coat hanging in limp folds that no longer fluttered because the wind had dropped to nothing more than a sigh. Straw inside compacted into a permanent shape that would never spring back. Its face of painted burlap faded to the same dull tone as the winter sky above. A figure so perfectly still it seemed part of the landscape itself, like the old fence posts half sunk into the ground, or the rusted gate that creaked only when someone remembered to oil it years ago. And the community continued its slow awakening without hurry or excitement. Windows cracked open for the first time in months to let in air that smelled faintly of wet soil and thawing manure, but closed again quickly because the chill still bit. Furnaces kept running at their lowest setting so the house stayed just warm enough to avoid shivering, and walked to her mailbox every third day now instead of every fourth, retrieving the same thin stack of circulars, and one bill she set aside unopened on the hall table to join the others. Her steps deliberate and short along the gravel drive where tiny pebbles shifted underfoot with the same soft crunch each time, returning to sit in the rocking chair that rocked forward and back in arcs so small they barely moved, eyes half focused on the distant line where field met sky, thoughts drifting without landing anywhere. And Maya planted a single row of early peas in the garden bed she had raked smooth the week before, pressing each seed into the cool soil with her thumb at the same depth, covering them one by one with the same gentle pat, then standing to watch the spot for long minutes as if something might happen immediately, though nothing did, before walking back inside to wash her hands under lukewarm water that ran forever because the faucet handle turned so slowly, and opened the barn doors wide for an hour in the middle of the day, letting pale sunlight fall across the concrete floor in a rectangle that crept across tools and hay bales at the pace of a minute hand on a stopped clock. Sweeping the same corner twice with the same broom whose bristles had worn down to stubs, then closing the doors again when the air turned cool, latching them with the same quiet click that echoed faintly before silence returned, and suppers remained the same comforting sameness. Baked beans from a can warmed on the stove until bubbles rose lazily to the surface, cornbread crumbled into bowls, a glass of milk left to sit until a skin formed on top that was stirred back in without thought. Eaten at the kitchen table under the single bulb that buzzed softly overhead, fork moving from plate to mouth in unvarying rhythm until the plate was clean and pushed aside. Chair scooted back with a slow scrape across linoleum, then settling into the recliner where the footrest rose with a faint mechanical whir. blanket pulled up to the chin, television tuned to the weather channel that showed maps of the Midwest with temperatures in the low 40s for tomorrow. The same as today, the same as yesterday. Announcers voice a steady murmur that required no listening, only presence. And as the light outside faded to the same soft charcoal it had been for weeks, eyelids began their slow descent, blinking longer each time, breaths deepening into the slow rise and fall of true rest. The day's small efforts dissolving like sugar in warm tea. No dreams to interrupt because the mind had nothing left to process, only the gentle sinking deeper and deeper through layers of accumulated quiet. Past the surface thoughts of chores and weather, past the faint memories of harvests long ago, into the core where nothing moved or changed or needed attention, where the scarecrow's endless vigil and the community's endless routines merged into one unbroken thread of stillness, carrying everything downward into the deepest, softest, most complete sleep imaginable, the kind that lasts all night without once stirring, cradling body and soul in perfect darkness under the vast, patient Midwestern sky that asks nothing and gives everything in its silent way. And as the tentative warmth of April 2029 finally began to seep into the soil of the preserve, with the first faint green haze appearing on the distant willow branches along the creek beds, where water trickled slowly over stones, still cold from winter, melting the last isolated snowdrifts into shallow puddles that reflected the pale sky without ripple or reflection of anything moving, the scarecrow stood in its accustomed place. Coat hanging heavy with absorbed moisture that dried in uneven patches under the weak sun. Straw inside shifting imperceptibly as it absorbed and released the damp in a cycle too slow to observe. Arms outstretched in the same unchanging gesture that had greeted countless seasons without variation or purpose beyond simple existence. And the community eased into spring routines with the familiar reluctance of bodies accustomed to winter's inertia. Rising a little earlier but still lingering in beds warmed by electric blankets left on low. Breakfasts of oatmeal stirred clockwise in the same pot until lumps dissolved into uniformity. Eaten from bowls chipped in the same places from years of the same spoons scraping the bottoms. Coffee refills poured without measuring, because the pot always held just enough for 3 cups spaced across the morning, and opened windows wider for longer periods now, letting in air that carried the faint, earthy scent of thawing fields, but closing them again when evening chill returned, curtains fluttering slightly in the draft before settling back into stillness. Her days filled with the quiet dusting of shelves that accumulated little since no one visited, cloth moving in slow circles over wood polished long ago, pauses lengthening as she gazed out at the scarecrow visible in the distance. A dark upright shape against the flat greening expanse that required no thought or comment, and Maya turned the soil in her garden plot row by row, forks sinking into the soft earth with the same resistance each time, turning clods that broke apart in her hands into crumbs that sifted through fingers chilled despite gloves, seeds planted in straight lines measured by eye alone, because rulers were unnecessary after so many years. Then watering from a can filled from the outdoor spigot that dripped steadily long after turned off, droplets falling one by one onto the dark soil until absorbed without trace, and mended fences where wires had sagged over winter, twisting them with pliers gripped in hands that moved deliberately, each twist the same as the last, posts checked by pushing against them with shoulder weight that yielded nothing because they had stood firm through worse, then walking the perimeter slowly. Boots sinking slightly into mud that released with a soft suck each step, breath even and unhurried in the mild air that still carried a bite at the edges. And evenings settled in with the same gradual dimming of light through windows now left uncovered. Suppers of fried eggs sliding from the same cast-iron skillet onto plates warmed in the oven at low heat. Bread toasted under the broiler watched carefully, but without tension because burning rarely happened anymore. Eaten while listening to the radio tuned to a station playing old country songs whose lyrics were known by heart and barely registered. Voices fading into background like the hum of the refrigerator, cycling on and off at predictable intervals. And dishes washed in water run hot, until steam fogged the glass, suds forming and bursting in slow motion under the sponge moved in circles that covered the same surfaces repeatedly, dried with towels that hung in the same folds on the rack. then settling into chairs or sofas where cushions had permanent impressions from bodies placed in the same positions night after night. Books or remotes held loosely in laps, eyes closing gradually as the room darkened further, breaths deepening into the slow rhythm of approaching sleep that needed no encouragement, only permission granted by the sheer weight of sameness accumulated over months and years. Pulling downward through familiar layers of drowsiness, where thoughts of planting or mending or dusting dissolved without resistance, sinking past the faint awareness of the scarecrow standing sentinel in the growing twilight, past the quiet fields stretching flat and endless under the emerging stars, into the deepest, softest core of rest, where nothing disturbed the perfect, featureless quiet, sleep wrapping everything in its gentle, unchanging embrace as completely as the vast Midwestern night enveloped the land in darkness unbroken and profound. And as the mild days of May 2029 unfolded with the same unvarying gentleness, skies clearing to a pale blue that deepened only slightly by midday before fatting back to washed-out hues at dusk, showers falling in brief, soft drizzles that soaked the soil just enough to darken it without forming puddles or running off in streams, the scarecrow remained anchored in its spot amid the emerging green of the preserve, grasses pushing up around its post in even tufts that grew at the same rate day by day. Wildflowers opening their small faces to the sun in scattered patches that spread slowly without urgency or pattern, coat drying fully now and hanging loose in the still air that carried only the faintest hum of emerging insects too distant to disturb the quiet, and the community settled into the familiar cadence of early summer preparation. Gardens weeded in short sessions with hoes moved in slow arcs that uprooted the same tender shoots appearing in the same places each year. Rows straightened by eye because straightness was habitual rather than necessary. Seeds of late crops dropped into furrows covered with the same gentle scrape of boot heels. Then watering cans tipped in measured pours that soaked the earth evenly without excess, and hung laundry on the line for the first time since fall, sheets and towels flapping lazily in breezes too weak to snap them, pins placed and removed with fingers that moved without haste. The fresh scent rising faintly as fabrics dried in the warm sun that felt pleasant but not hot, folding done on the porch steps while sitting for long intervals watching clouds drift in shapes that changed imperceptibly over hours. And Maya harvested the first radishes, pulling them one by one with a gentle twist, tops trimmed with the same kitchen shears snipping at the same angle, washed under the tap in a colander that rattled softly against the sink. Sliced thinly onto plates for lunches eaten slowly with bread and butter spread thick because melting was slow in the cool indoors. Crumbs brushed away with the same absent swipe of hand across the tablecloth stained in familiar patterns, and checked the mower only to find it needed nothing. Oil level the same as last month, blade sharpened already from previous seasons, instead pushing it across the lawn in overlapping passes that left grass clippings in even windrows drying to hay scent by evening. Then raked into piles left to sit, because composting happened gradually without intervention, sitting afterward on the porch step with a glass of water condensing slowly in the humidity that built just enough to make skin feel sticky but not uncomfortable, and evenings lengthened with light lingering until suppers of cold ham sliced from the bone kept in the refrigerator, potatoes boiled until soft and mashed with forks in the same bowl, green beans snapped and steamed in the same pot with lid rattling faintly from the bubbling below, eaten at the table with windows open to let in the chorus of frogs from the distant pond, starting and stopping in waves that rose and fell without rhythm or reason, dishes stacked in the sink to soak overnight, because washing could wait until morning when energy returned with the coolness. Then moving to living rooms where fans turned on low, pushing air in circles that stirred curtains gently. Televisions watched with half attention to programs repeating themes from decades past, voices murmuring familiar lines that required no focus, bodies sinking into cushions molded to shapes unchanged for years, eyelids lowering gradually as the sky outside darkened from pale to deeper blue to black speckled with the same stars emerging in the same order night after night, breath slowing to match the quiet hum of the house settling. Thoughts of gardens and mowing and laundry fatting like the last light over the fields, pulling everything downward through soft layers of accumulating drowsiness, where nothing demanded effort or attention, sinking past the distant outline of the scarecrow standing silent under the emerging moon, past the endless flatness of greening land stretching to every horizon, into the deepest, most welcoming core of sleep, where the world dissolved entirely into perfect, undisturbed darkness cradling everything in its gentle, timeless hold under the vast and patient Midwestern sky. And as the lush fullness of June 2029 enveloped the preserve in a heavy blanket of green, with the grasses reaching knee-high and swaying in the slightest breaths of warm air that carried the sweet, heavy scent of clover blooming in scattered patches across the fields, bees droning in low, constant hums that blended into the background like the distant murmur of a stream too far away to see, the scarecrow stood immersed in this verdant sea. Its post surrounded by foliage that brushed against its legs in gentle, repetitive caresses whenever the breeze stirred. Coat now sun-faded to a uniform pale gray that matched the dust on country roads kicked up by occasional passing tractors moving at leisurely speeds. Straw inside warmed by the long days, but releasing no scent beyond the faint mustiness accumulated over seasons of rain and drought. Arms outstretched in the same eternal pose that had become as natural to the landscape as the rolling clouds building slowly in the western sky each afternoon before dispersing without rain. And the community drifted through these long, languid days with the deep inertia of midsummer. Mornings starting late with the sun already high filtering through curtains drawn against the heat that built gradually from pleasant warmth to a sticky humidity that made shirts cling and movements slow to a crawl. Breakfasts of fresh berries picked from bushes along fence rows eaten straight from the bowl with fingers stained purple. Juice dripping slowly down chins wiped with the backs of hands that moved without haste. Coffee left to cool on tables because hot drinks lost appeal in the rising temperatures, and tended her flower beds in short bursts early in the day, kneeling on the same cushioned pad to pull weeds that came up easily in the soft soil. Each one dropped into the same bucket that filled gradually over hours interrupted by long sits in the shade of the porch, where iced tea sweated in glasses refilled from pitchers condensing on the rail. Ice cubes clinking softly as they melted into watery sweetness sipped through straws that gurgled at the bottom. And Maya harvested lettuce leaves outer first in the cool of dawn, heads left to grow larger for later pickings, washed in the sink under water run cold until numb fingers protested mildly. Torn into salads dressed with oil and vinegar shaken in the same jar with lids screwed on and off countless times. Eaten on the back step watching butterflies flutter in aimless patterns over the garden without landing long enough to identify. And mowed the paths through the preserve once a week now. Tractor chugging along in low gear leaving trails of clipped grass that dried to hay in the sun. Scent rising strong and sweet before fatting into the overall green perfume of the fields. Stopping often to idle while wiping brow with the same red folded and refolded in the pocket, gazing at the scarecrow emerging from the tall grass like a solitary island, its form requiring no maintenance because patches held and straw stayed put through the calm, and afternoons stretched interminably in the heat that pressed down like a heavy hand encouraging stillness, porch swings creaking in slow arcs pushed by toes barely lifting from the floorboards warmed by sun. Naps taken in hammocks strung between trees where leaves filtered light into dappled patterns shifting gradually across closed eyelids. Breaths deepening to match the lazy rhythm of cicadas starting their whine in the treetops. Rising and falling in waves that lulled rather than disturbed. Books held open, but unread as pages fluttered occasionally in breezes too weak to turn them. And evenings brought brief relief with the sun dipping low casting long golden light across the flats. Suppers of cold chicken from the refrigerator sliced thick and eaten with pickles speared from jars on forks that moved leisurely between plate and mouth. Corn on the cob boiled just enough to warm through shucked earlier in the day. Butter melting slowly down the rows nibbled one kernel at a time. Windows open wide to catch any stir of air that carried the night sounds of crickets chirping in endless chorus starting soft and building to a steady wall of sound that enveloped everything in its monotonous embrace. Dishes left to soak because tomorrow's cooler morning would make washing easier, then settling into lawn chairs or indoor rockers where fans oscillated slowly pushing warm air from one side to the other. Conversations, if any, limited to murmurs about the heat or the chance of rain that never quite materialized. Voices trailing off into pauses filled by the night insects. Eyelids growing heavier in the dimming light from lamps turned low. Bodies sinking deeper into seats molded perfectly to familiar shapes. Thoughts of gardens and mowing and harvesting dissolving like mist in the morning sun, but now in reverse as darkness gathered, pulling everything downward through thick layers of accumulating drowsiness, where the day's small warmth lingered in muscles relaxed to the point of limpness, sinking past the distant silhouette of the scarecrow bathed in moonlight filtering through thin clouds, past the endless green expanse whispering softly in the night breeze, into the deepest, most profound core of sleep where boundaries blurred entirely, and the world receded into perfect, featureless oblivion cradling body, and mind in its soft, timeless depths under the immense and star-scattered Midwestern sky that watched over all with indifferent patience. And as the sultry depths of July 2029 pressed down upon the preserve with a heat that shimmered over the field's invisible waves, turning the air thick and hazy, so that distant silos blurred into mirage-like shapes against the pale sky, the tall grasses baking in the sun until their tips curled slightly, and released a dry, hay-like scent that mingled with the faint sweetness of milkweed blooming in untended corners, the scarecrow stood enveloped in this golden haze, its form half lost amid the swaying stalks that brushed against its coat in slow, rhythmic sweeps whenever a rare breeze stirred from the west, carrying the distant rumble of thunder that built clouds on the horizon only to dissipate them again without delivering rain. Straw inside warmed through and through until it felt like part of the earth itself, coat hanging heavy and motionless in the still air that seemed to hold its breath through the longest days. Arms outstretched in the same silent vigil that had endured through countless such summers without shift, or where beyond the gradual fading of colors to a uniform sun-bleached neutrality, and the community sank deeper into the languorous rhythm of high summer, days beginning with the slow rise from beds damp with night sweat, sheets kicked to the foot in twisted heaps. Mornings spent in shaded rooms with fans whirring steadily on medium speed, pushing the warm air from corner to corner without cooling anything truly. Breakfasts light and drawn out. Slices of melon cut into wedges eaten over the sink to catch the juice dripping in slow rivulets down chins and wrists, wiped on dish towels hanging from the same hooks. Coffee forsaken for taller glasses of iced water with lemon slices floating lazily on the surface. Ice melting quickly into dilution that was sipped anyway through the long hours, and watered her flowers only at dusk, when the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the beds, hose trickling in a steady stream that soaked the roots deeply, while surface soil dried almost immediately in the residual heat, standing there with bare feet in the cooling grass long after the task was done, watching fireflies begin their early flickers in the gathering twilight that came reluctantly after the prolonged light. And Maya picked tomatoes as they ripened one by one, twisting them gently from vines heavy with fruit that hung like red lanterns in the foliage, sliced thick on plates with salt shaken from the same shaker refilled seasonally, eaten with fingers sticky from the juice that ran down elbows propped on the porch rail, seeds flicked into the yard where they might sprout next year or not without concern, and repaired nothing urgent, instead oiling the same tools twice in a week because the can was already out. Rags wiping blades that gleamed dully in the barn's dim interior, where sunlight slanted through cracks in golden bars too bright to look at directly, sitting afterward on the cool concrete floor leaning against hay bales that smelled of last year's cut, eyes closed against the dust motes dancing in the light, breath slowing to match the heat-induced torpor that made even thinking feel like wadding through molasses, and afternoons dissolved into extended siestas in darkened rooms with blinds drawn tight. Bodies stretched on couches or beds with limbs akimbo to catch any faint circulation from ceiling fans turning in endless circles. Naps deepening without intention into hours where time lost meaning. Waking groggy only to drink more water and return to the same spot, because movement required effort better conserved. Evenings bringing the slightest easing as the sun finally relinquished its grip. Suppers of salads assembled from garden greens wilted slightly in the heat, but crisp enough when dressed lightly, eaten outdoors on picnic tables sticky from humidity, forks moving in unhurried bites while mosquitoes began their whine too lazily to swat effectively. Conversations, if they arose, limited to observations of the cloudless sky or the dryness of the soil repeated from previous days. Voices low and trailing into silences filled by the steady chorus of katydids starting early and building to a wall of sound that enveloped everything in its repetitive drone. Dishes rinsed quickly under the outdoor spigot because indoors felt stifling, then settling into rockers or lawn chairs where cushions sank deeper under weight redistributed nightly. Stars emerging one by one in the vast clearing sky that cooled slowly from deep indigo to black. Eyelids drooping in the soft darkness broken only by the occasional porch light left on low. Breaths lengthening into the heavy rhythm of impending sleep that needed no coaxing in the exhaustive warmth. Thoughts of watering and picking and oiling fatting like the last embers of daylight over the endless fields, pulling everything downward through thick, velvety layers of accumulated fatigue, where muscles unwound completely and awareness softened to nothing, sinking past the distant. Moonlit outline of the scarecrow standing sentinel amid the whispering grasses, past the flat expanse of land stretching boundlessly under the star-drenched sky, into the deepest, most enveloping core of sleep where the world dissolved into perfect, undisturbed oblivion cradling body and soul in its gentle, timeless depths through the long, quiet Midwestern night. And as the relentless haze of August 2029 hung over the preserve like a thick, unmoving veil, with the sun beating down through a sky bleached to a pale, washed-out white that offered no shade or relief, the fields turning from vibrant green to a dry, brittle gold that rustled faintly in the occasional hot gusts carrying dust from the parched county roads. The scarecrow stood deep within this scorched expanse, its coat now stiff with accumulated grit that clung to the fabric in fine layers. Straw inside baked to a crisp dryness that crackled imperceptibly with any rare shift in the wind. Arms outstretched in the same unwavering pose that had weathered droughts before, and would weather this one too without complaint or change. A silent sentinel amid the endless sea of wilting corn and soybeans curling their leaves inward to conserve what little moisture remained in the cracking soil. And the community retreated further into the cool dimness of homes sealed against the oppressive heat. Doors and windows closed tight with shades pulled low to block the glaring light that turned interiors into caves of quiet stagnation. Fans running constantly on high, but only stirring the warm air into sluggish currents that offered no real cooling. Mornings blending seamlessly into afternoons without the energy to distinguish them. Breakfasts skipped or reduced to glasses of lukewarm water from pitchers left on counters overnight. Condensation long since evaporated. Sipped slowly while standing in kitchens where floors felt warm under bare feet, and ceased her evening watering altogether as the hose lay coiled unused in the shed. Flowers drooping but surviving in their stubborn way just as everything did. Her days passed in the recliner with legs propped on the ottoman, a damp cloth folded on her forehead that warmed quickly, and was only when the discomfort became noticeable. Eyes closed against the filtered light seeping around curtain edges, breaths shallow in the heavy air. And Maya left the garden to fend for itself, tomatoes splitting on the vines from the stress, but picked anyway when the mood struck. Brought inside to sit on the counter, ripening further into softness that was sliced and eaten with salt in small bites over the sink. Juice running down hands washed lazily under a trickle of water conserved from the well that ran deeper this year, and avoided the barn's stifling interior. Instead, checking livestock water troughs topped off from the hose dragged slowly across the yard, levels dropping visibly day by day, but refilled just enough to prevent distress. Then retreating to the basement where concrete walls held a faint coolness, sitting on an old folding chair with a battery-powered fan blowing directly on his face, staring at cobwebs in the rafters that swayed gently in the artificial breeze, time passing in unmarked increments measured only by the occasional need to change batteries. And afternoons stretched into interminable voids of inactivity, bodies prone on beds or couches with sheets pushed aside, limbs spread to maximize exposure to any faint air movement, naps deepening into heavy, dreamless states interrupted only by turning over to a cooler side of the pillow that warmed almost immediately, waking hours, if any, spent in minimal motion, turning pages of magazines read before, channels flipped on televisions muted to avoid the drone of voices adding to the heat. Cold drinks, if available, nursed over hours until flat and room temperature, and evenings offered no respite as the heat radiated back from the ground long after sunset. Skis clear and star-filled, but air still and thick. Suppers, if eaten at all, consisting of cereal poured into bowls with milk straight from the fridge that warmed quickly on the table. Spoons moving in slow, mechanical dips until satisfaction came or appetite faded entirely. Dishes left where they sat because washing required standing at the sink too long, then collapsing into beds with windows cracked only slightly to avoid insects drawn to lights left off. Fans positioned to blow across bodies stripped to minimal clothing damp with perspiration. Breaths labored in the humidity until exhaustion pulled them under. Thoughts of gardens neglected and troughs half-full dissolving in the haze. Sinking through layers of oppressive warmth where muscles went limp and awareness blurred at the edges. Pulling everything downward past the faint moonlight silhouette of the scarecrow standing unyielding in the moon-baked fields. Past the endless cracked earth stretching flat and unforgiving under the vast, indifferent sky scattered with stars that offered no comfort. Into the deepest, heaviest core of sleep, where the body surrendered completely to the weight of the season, cradled in profound, sweat-soaked oblivion that lasted through the long, stifling nights of the Midwestern drought, without disturbance or relief. And as the first tentative rains of early September 2029 finally broke the long drought, falling in soft, steady sheets that soaked the parched earth without drama or flood, turning the dust to mud that smelled richly of renewal, as steam rose faintly from the warming soil under skies that cleared gradually to a deeper blue scrubbed clean by the storms. The preserve drank it in deeply, grasses perking up almost visibly day by day. Wildflowers late in blooming opening their faces to the cooler air that followed the fronts passing through with distant thunder rumbling like a memory fatting over the horizon. The scarecrow standing drenched, and then drying in patches as the sun returned milder now, coat darkening with moisture before lightening again to its familiar fade. Straw swelling slightly with absorbed water only to contract once more in the gentle warmth. Arms outstretched catching droplets that slid down the sleeves in slow trails before dripping from the cuffs to the ground where they joined the puddles reflecting the changing clouds. A figure renewed in its quiet endurance without need for repair or attention. And the community emerged slowly from the heat-induced seclusion, windows flung open wide to let in the fresh, rain-washed air that carried the scent of wet leaves and turned soil. Fans switched off for the first time in weeks, allowing silence to settle deeper in rooms that felt cooler almost immediately. Mornings greeted with the sound of dripping eaves and the distant call of migrating birds passing overhead in loose formations. Breakfast returning to hot oatmeal stirred slowly with spoons that clinked against bowls in the same rhythm. Coffee brewed stronger to match the invigorating chill at the edges of the days, and resumed her evening walks along the gravel paths now firmed by the rains. Boots sinking just enough to leave faint prints that filled with water and disappeared by morning, pausing often to breathe deeply the cleansed air while watching the scarecrow in the distance standing amid the reviving fields, its form a constant punctuation in the vast green reclaiming its vibrancy. And Maya harvested the last stubborn tomatoes softened by the drought, but sweetened intensely, canning them in jars that lined the shelves in neat rows, sealed with the same satisfying pop of lids cooling. Labels written in the same careful script, nodding the year though the taste would be indistinguishable from previous seasons, and hauled the mower out again for a final cut before fall, blades slicing through the refreshed grass that bent willingly under the wheels, clippings left to mulch naturally as the scent rose fresh and sharp in the cooler air, then storing the machine away with a wipe-down that removed the accumulated dust of disuse. Hands moving steadily, but without rush in the pleasant temperatures that invited lingering outdoors, and afternoons shortened with clouds building and dispersing in harmless patterns. Naps taken now under light blankets on porches where rockers creaked in slow arcs pushed by feet enjoying the swing. Books opened, and actually read page by page, as concentration returned with the relief from heat, and evenings cooled quickly with suppers of soup simmered on stoves that warmed the kitchens comfortably. Ingredients from the garden chopped on the same cutting boards worn smooth from years of the same knives. Eaten at tables with windows cracked to hear the crickets resuming their chorus softer now in the post-rain hush. Dishes washed immediately in hot soapy water that steamed up the glass and cleared just as quickly, then settling into chairs by lamps turned on earlier as darkness fell sooner. Televisions or radios playing low with programs or music that filled the background without demanding attention. Bodies relaxing fully into the cushions as the day's mild activities wound down. Breaths evening out in the comfortable temperature that neither chilled nor overheated. Thoughts of rains and harvests and walks fatting gently like the last light over the fields. pulling everything downward through soothing layers of post-storm calm, where muscles unwound and minds emptied of effort. Sinking past the twilight silhouette of the scarecrow standing patient amid the settling mist rising from the warmed earth. Past the endless flats now softened by the rains under the vast sky clearing to reveal stars emerging one by one, into the deepest, most restorative core of sleep, where the world dissolved into perfect, tranquil oblivion, cradling everything in its gentle, renewing depths through the quiet, refreshing nights of the Midwestern early fall. And as the crisp clarity of October 2029 painted the preserve in layers of amber and rust, with leaves turning in slow waves across the maples and oaks lining the distant creeks, falling one by one to carpet the ground in a cushioned mat that muffled footsteps and released a faint, earthy scent when crushed under boot or hoof, the scarecrow stood amid the changing hues, its coat catching stray leaves that clung briefly before drifting away in the gentle gusts that carried the distant honk of geese heading south in ragged lines etched against the pale autumn sky. Straw inside settling further into compactness from the drying winds. Arms outstretched as always in silent greeting to the shortening days that brought earlier twilights and cooler nights filled with the soft rustle of settling foliage. A presence so woven into the seasonal shift that it seemed to orchestrate the quiet transformation without effort or notice. And the community eased into harvest routines with the familiar deliberation of hands knowing each motion by heart. Combines moving through fields in steady passes that left stubble rose golden in the slanting light. Grain pouring into wagons in continuous streams that filled the air with dust, settling slowly on everything, including the scarecrow's shoulders where it brushed off unnoticed. Pumpkins gathered from vines withered by first frosts, stacked in piles by the barn doors to cure in the mild sun that warmed without burning, and baked pies from apples picked from the old tree behind the house, peeling in long spirals that fell into the sink in the same curling patterns. Filling rolled out on the floured board with cinnamon and sugar measured by eye because recipes were memorized long ago. Ovens warming the kitchen to a comfortable glow that invited lingering over coffee refills poured steaming into mugs held close for the heat seeping through ceramic. And Maya canned the last of the garden produce, jars boiling in the big pot on the stove with lids bubbling softly until sealed with the familiar ping that echoed through the quiet house, labels affixed with glue sticks dried from infrequent use. Shelves filling row by row in the pantry that smelled of vinegar and spices blending into a tangy warmth, and stacked firewood split earlier in the year, cords building neatly against the shed wall in interlocking patterns that locked tight against winter winds yet to come. Axe set aside because the pile sufficed, hands calloused but resting now in pockets while surveying the work with satisfaction that required no words, and afternoons shortened with the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the flats that stretched the scarecrow's silhouette into a giant across the stubble fields. Naps taken indoors by windows where sunlight fell in fatting pools on quilts pulled over laps, books or newspapers folded open to the same pages for days, eyes closing gradually in the pleasant tiredness of accomplished chores, and evenings cooled swiftly with suppers of roasted meats from the freezer thawed slowly on counters, potatoes baked in foil that crinkled when unwrapped steaming hot. Vegetables from jars opened with the twist of lids still tight from summer sealing, eaten at tables with candles lit early because darkness gathered quickly. Conversations murmuring about the yield or the colors this year compared to last in tones that trailed into thoughtful pauses filled by the crackle of the first fires in stoves stoked low for the night. Dishes washed in water run hot until hands reddened pleasantly, dried with towels hung to warm by the heat. Then settling into chairs pulled close to the glow where socks were darned or newspapers scanned idly, the radio playing soft music or weather reports predicting the first frost already past, bodies relaxing fully into the armrests and cushions worn soft, breaths evening out in the dry warmth that chased away the outdoor chill, thoughts of harvests and canning and stacking fatting like the embers settling into coals. Pulling everything downward through cozy layers of autumnal contentment, where limbs grew heavy and minds unwound slowly, sinking past the window view of the scarecrow standing dark against the deepening twilight, past the endless fields now stripped and resting under the rising moon, into the deepest, most comforting core of sleep, where the world softened into perfect, peaceful oblivion, cradling everything in its gentle, familiar depths, through the quiet, starlit nights of the Midwestern fall. And as the deepening chill of November 2029 settled over the preserve like a soft, gray shroud, with bare branches etching delicate patterns against skis that turned leaden and low, shedding occasional flurries that melted on contact or accumulated in thin veils across the stubble fields where the last leaves clung stubbornly before releasing in silent spirals to the ground. The scarecrow stood resolute in the quiet desolation. Its coat rhymed with frost each dawn that glistened briefly in the weak sunlight before sublimating into the dry air. Straw inside contracting in the cold without sound or shift, arms outstretched in eternal patience as the winds picked up slightly from the north, carrying the faint scent of impending snow from distant fronts marching slowly across the plains. A figure etched darker against the paling landscape that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of winter's full embrace. And the community drew inward with the familiar rituals of preparation. Woodpiles checked and topped off with logs carried one by one from stacks covered in tarps now stiff with frost. Barns buttoned up with doors latched tight against the gusts that rattled loose tin on roofs echoing faintly in the stillness. Blankets unearthed from cedar chests smelling of mothballs and summers past shaken out and layered on beds that creaked under the added weight, and baked bread more often now. Dough rising slowly by the stove in bowls covered with the same tea towels embroidered decades ago, kneaded with hands that moved in unhurried rhythms on the floured counter. Ovens warming the house to a cozy glow that fogged windows briefly before clearing to reveal the unchanging view of fields fatting to white. And Maya sorted through pantry shelves, rearranging jars by content in rows that aligned perfectly, because alignment brought quiet satisfaction in the short days. Lids wiped clean of dust accumulated since summer sealing. Recipes consulted idly for holiday meals planned without urgency because time stretched ample in the indoor confinement, and sharpened tools for spring already knowing they would dull again waiting. Whetstone stroked along blades in steady passes that produced a rhythmic rasp filling the shed where breath clouded visibly in the cold air seeping through cracks, then hung on pegboards in the same order cleaned yearly. Hands warmed afterward around mugs of cocoa thickened with milk from the fridge that steamed invitingly, and afternoons darkened early with lamps switched on by midday casting pools of yellow light on rugs worn thin in traffic paths trod daily. Naps taken under afghans crocheted in patterns repeated generation after generation. Heads nodding forward in rockers that moved in slow, diminishing arcs until stopping altogether. Breaths deepening in the dry heat from stoves stoked steadily with splits that crackled softly, and evenings closed in swiftly with suppers of casseroles assembled from pantry staples baked until bubbling gently at the edges. Scents of cheese and onion filling rooms that felt smaller and safer in the encroaching dark, eaten at tables set with the same faded from countless washings, forks scraping plates in familiar cadences that slowed as fullness settled heavy and comforting. Dishes washed in sinks running hot until steam rose thick and cleansing, dried slowly with towels that absorbed the warmth, then gathering by the fire where socks were pulled higher, and books opened to pages marked with ribbons frayed at the ends. Radio murmuring weather reports of approaching lows and possible accumulations spoken in calm voices that required no real attention. Bodies sinking deeper into chairs angled toward the flames, dancing low and steady. Eyelids lowering gradually in the flickering glow that cast shadows shifting lazily across walls papered in patterns unchanged for decades. Breaths evening out into the slow rhythm of true repose earned from the day's quiet efforts. Thoughts of wood piles and baking and sharpening fatting like smoke up the chimney into the night air, pulling everything downward through warm, enveloping layers of hearthside contentment, where limbs grew impossibly heavy and minds released the last threads of wakefulness. Sinking past the window's frosted view of the scarecrow standing solitary under the emerging stars piercing the cloud breaks, past the endless bare fields stretching silent and waiting under the vast Midwestern sky now deepening to ink, into the deepest, most nurturing core of sleep, where the world softened entirely into perfect, undisturbed peace cradling body and soul in its gentle, timeless depths through the long, hushed nights of approaching winter. And as the first substantial snows of December 2029 blanketed the preserve in a deep, unbroken white that muffled every sound and turned the world into a vast, hushed expanse, where the effigy mounds slumbered beneath their soft covering like ancient secrets wrapped in down. The scarecrow stood half-buried once more, its upper body emerging from the drifts that piled gently around its post in wind-sculpted curves. Coat crusted with ice that sparkled faintly in the low winter sun filtering through high, thin clouds. Straw inside insulated by the snow's embrace holding the cold at bay without shift or complaint. Arms outstretched catching the occasional flake that melted on contact or clung briefly before the next gust dislodged it. A solitary figure etched against the endless pale fields that stretched flat and featureless to every horizon under skies that promised more snow in slow-moving fronts visible days away. And the community nestled into the heart of winter with the deep contentment of seasons fully turned. Homes warmed by stoves fed steadily with wood that crackled low and constant, smoke rising in thin plumes that hung in the still, frigid air before dissipating into the gray. Windows frosted in delicate feathers that obscured the outside world, just enough to make indoors feel like a cocoon separate from the cold. Mornings beginning late, with the dim light seeping through curtains heavy with insulation. Breakfasts of pancakes stacked thick and dripping syrup warmed on the griddle until bubbles formed slowly in the batter, eaten with forks cutting through layers in the same deliberate bites, while coffee steamed in mugs refilled without counting, and knitted scarves from yarn unraveled from old sweaters, needles clicking in rhythmic patterns that produced rows inch by inch over hours spent in the chair closest to the heat. Patterns simple and repeated because complexity required concentration better saved for spring. Pauses lengthening as eyes closed briefly in the warmth that encouraged dozing mid-stitch. And Maya baked cookies from recipes handed down unchanged. Dough chilled in the fridge overnight, rolled out on the counter dusted with flour that puffed softly in clouds, settling on aprons tied the same way. Cutters pressing shapes that emerged identical batch after batch. Oven timers ticking down minutes stretched in the quiet kitchen scented with vanilla and sugar browning gently, and shoveled paths only when necessary. Snow thrown in rhythmic arcs that piled along edges already high from previous storms. Breath clouding in thick plumes that froze on mustaches before melting indoors by the stove where boots dripped steadily on rubber mats placed years ago. Hands thawed around bowls of soup simmered from bones saved in the freezer. And afternoons vanished in the short daylight with lamps on early casting warm circles on tables where puzzles were assembled piece by piece in no hurry to finish, because unfinished was fine for weeks, or cards shuffled for games of solitaire laid out in fans that were gathered and reshuffled when patterns stalled. Naps taken under quilts pieced from scraps of dresses and shirts worn by generations past. Heads sinking into pillows fluffed nightly, breaths deepening in the dry. Wood-scented air that lulled without effort, and evenings gathered around hearths or kitchens with suppers of roasts cooked low and slow, until falling apart on forks. Potatoes mashed with butter melting into creamy swirls. Pies from the freezer thawed and warmed until filling bubbled gently at the crust edges. Eaten in silence broken only by the occasional compliment murmured softly. Dishes washed in teams or alone with water running hot, until the last plate was dried and stacked in cupboards that closed with the same soft thud. Then settling into living rooms where televisions glowed with holiday specials watched yearly without surprise. Volumes low enough that dialogue blended with the stove's hum and the wind's faint moan outside. Bodies bundled in robes and slippers shuffling to beds early because darkness encouraged it. Blankets piled high trapping heat that built gradually. Eyelids closing as soon as heads touched pillows indented perfectly. Breath slowing to the steady cadence of deep repose. Thoughts of knitting and baking and shoveling dissolving like snowflakes on warm skin, pulling everything downward through thick, comforting layers of winter's embrace where limbs grew heavy and minds emptied completely, sinking past the frosted window's view of the scarecrow standing buried and patient under the moonlight filtering through clouds. Past the endless snow-covered fields stretching silent and vast under the immense Midwestern sky dotted with stars sharp in the cold clarity. Into the deepest, most profound core of sleep where the world faded entirely into perfect, nurturing oblivion cradling body and soul in its gentle, unchanging depths through the long, tranquil nights of deepest winter. And as the profound stillness of January 2030 enveloped the preserve in an even deeper layer of snow that fell in silent, relentless flakes through the long nights, accumulating in drifts sculpted by winds that whispered low across the flats before dying away into calm. The effigy mounds buried completely now under a smooth, undulating white that erased all traces of their ancient shapes until spring's revelation. The scarecrow protruded only slightly from the mounds that embraced its base. Its head and shoulders crusted with a cap of ice that formed and reformed with each freeze and brief thaw. Coat stiffened into a rigid shell that cracked faintly when gusts pressed against it. Straw inside preserved in frozen suspension, holding the cold without decay or movement. Arms outstretched collecting snow in gentle piles along their length that slid off in small avalanches undisturbed by any witness, a lone marker in the vast. Featureless where animal tracks crisscrossed sparingly before being covered anew by the next fall. And the community hibernated in the truest sense with days blurred into one continuous indoor existence. Curtains drawn against the perpetual gray light that filtered weakly through storm windows etched with permanent frost patterns. Stoves tended with pokers stirred lazily through coals banked overnight to last until morning. Smoke from chimneys rising straight and thin in the motionless air, before vanishing into the low ceiling of clouds promising more snow indefinitely. Mornings indistinguishable from evenings with clocks consulted rarely because time lost urgency in the endless white outside. Breakfasts merging into midday snacks of toast, buttered thick and eaten over sinks to catch crumbs that fell anyway onto floors, swept only when paths became obstructed. Coffee pots left percolating on low to provide endless refills, sipped from the same mugs rinsed but not washed fully for days. And mended clothes piled from fall, needle threading through fabrics in slow, deliberate stitches that repaired tears unnoticed, until winter idleness brought them to light. Thimble pressing familiarly on the finger worn smooth from years of the same motion. Pauses for warming hands around the mug, or simply staring at the flame dancing low in the glass-fronted stove. And Maya the pantry yet again counting jars and cans in neat tallies entered into notebooks with entries dated loosely, because precision mattered less than the reassurance of sufficiency. Shelves dusted lightly with rags that picked up little since nothing disturbed the air indoors, and read manuals for equipment stored away, or simply sat by the window watching snow fall in its hypnotic descent flake by flake, until patterns hypnotized the eyes into closing. Chair creaking occasionally under shifts in weight that grew fewer as comfort deepened into immobility. And afternoons, if distinguished at all, passed in the glow of lamps, turned on permanently to combat the gloom, puzzles or crosswords attempted with pencils chewed at the ends erased and rewritten in the same squares, because solutions evaded or interest waned midway. Naps blending seamlessly from sitting to reclining under blankets heavy with accumulated warmth, breaths deepening in the dry. Pine-scented heat that filled lungs slowly and completely, and evenings non-existent in the perpetual dim with suppers of leftovers reheated in the same pans, scraped clean with spatulas worn thin. Flavors blending into comforting sameness eaten in robes and slippers, shuffled across floors that creaked in predictable spots. Dishes stacked to soak indefinitely, because tomorrow mirrored today exactly. Then migrating to beds early with hot water bottles filled from kettles whistling softly on the stove. Sheets warmed by bodies sinking into mattresses sagged perfectly to familiar forms. Eyelids closing before lights were even extinguished because darkness inside matched the endless night outside. Breath slowing to the profound rhythm of winter dormancy. Thoughts of mending and counting and watching dissolving like breath on cold glass. Pulling everything downward through thick, insulating layers of snow-like quiet, where the mind released all hold on seasons or stories. Sinking past the buried silhouette of the scarecrow, barely visible through frosted panes under the faint moonlight piercing occasional cloud breaks. Past the infinite white fields, stretching silent and immutable under the vast Midwestern sky heavy with unspoken promise of continuation. Into the deepest, most absolute core of sleep, where existence narrowed to the gentle pulse of rest-cradling body and soul in perfect, timeless suspension through the boundless, hushed nights of midwinter's heart. And as the unyielding grip of February 2030 tightened further over the preserve, with temperatures plunging to depths that froze the snow into a hard, crystalline crust capable of bearing weight without a trace. The air so cold and dry it burned the lungs on deep breaths taken only when necessary. The Scarecrow remained a frozen monument, half entombed in ice, that encased its lower half in a glassy sheath formed from drifting snow compacted by wind and refrozen in the relentless nights. Its visible portions crusted with that built-in delicate feathers radiating outward like frozen breath captured mid-exhalation. Coat stiffened into an unyielding board that no gust could ruffle, straw inside locked in absolute stasis, where neither moisture nor decay could reach. Arms outstretched in crystalline rigidity collecting rime that thickened imperceptibly hour by hour. A silent sentinel in the vast. Glittering wasteland where the sun rose low and pale, casting long blue shadows that barely warmed anything before sinking again into prolonged twilight. And the community retreated to the deepest core of winter endurance. Homes insulated by drifts piled against foundations that blocked drafts more effectively than any caulk. Stoves fed with the largest logs, saved for these stretches burning slow and hot through days and nights with ashes raked only when the firebox filled to the brim. Smoke from chimneys frozen into vertical columns that rose only a short distance before falling back as ice particles glittering in the rare sunlight. Mornings, if acknowledged at all, beginning with the slow creak of beds, as bodies emerged from beneath piles of quilts and comforters layered like strata, feet seeking slippers chilled, overnight despite proximity to the heat. Breakfasts of hot cereals cooked thick and slow on stovetops that provided the only real warmth in kitchens where windows were opaque with frost inches thick etched in patterns too dense to scrape clear. Spoons stirring in endless circles until lumps dissolved into uniformity eaten standing over the pot to conserve dishes and capture every wisp of steam, coffee brewed in percolators that bubbled eternally on the back burner, refilled without measuring because strength varied little in the sameness. And crocheted doilies or afghans from yarn balls rolled and re-rolled in laps warmed by the task itself, hooks moving in hypnotic loops that produced chains and shells in patterns committed to muscle memory, pauses for thawing fingers curled around mugs, or simply resting in the cradle of the project as eyes drifted shut in the heavy warmth radiating from the stove's cast iron. And Maya reviewed seed catalogs arrived months ago, but saved for these endless indoor days. Pages turned slowly with fingers stiff from cold despite gloves worn indoors, circling varieties that might perform better next year though choices changed little from season to season. The catalog propped open on the table beside cooling tea that was reheated multiple times before finishing, and whittled nothing in particular from soft pine blocks producing shavings that curled identically and piled on newspaper spread across the table. Knife strokes deliberate and unvarying until the block diminished to nothing or interest waned. Shavings swept later into the stove to flare briefly before settling into ash-joining layers accumulated over weeks. And afternoons ceased to exist in the perpetual semi-darkness, with lamps burning constantly on low watts to save bulbs that were replaced rarely. Activities limited to shifting positions in chairs angled toward the heat source. Books held but unread as pages blurred in the dry air that made eyes tire quickly. Naps extending from one meal to the next without clear boundaries. Bodies bundled in layers of sweaters and shawls that added bulk but necessary insulation. Breaths visible even indoors when moving away from the stove's radius. And evenings indistinguishable with suppers of stews, thickened from root vegetables stored in cellars reached through traps chilled to near freezing, ladled into bowls that warmed hands before mouths. Eaten in slow spoonfuls that cooled quickly in the air, bread torn from loaves baked days ago but still edible when toasted on the stovetop held with forks, dishes minimal, and rinsed cursorily to avoid cold water from taps that ran icy despite bleeding. Then migrating early to beds piled higher with every available blanket and quilt, hot bricks or bottles wrapped in towels placed at feet that thawed gradually, bodies curling into fetal warmth conserved through stillness. Eyelids sealing shut as soon as horizontal because verticality demanded too much in the profound cold, breath slowing to the minimal rhythm sustainable in deepest conservation. Thoughts of crocheting and circling and whittling dissolving entirely in the enveloping quiet, pulling everything downward through dense, insulating layers of winter's profoundest hold where awareness narrowed to the faint pulse of survival. Sinking past the opaque window's barrier to the Scarecrow frozen in eternal vigil under the faint auroral glow occasionally gracing the clearest nights. past the infinite crystalline fields stretching immutable and sparkling under the vast Midwestern sky pierced by stars burning cold and distant, into the deepest, most absolute core of sleep, where existence suspended in perfect, frozen peace cradling body and soul in its gentle, unyielding depths through the endless, silent nights of winter's zenith. And as the faint stirrings of March 2030 finally whispered through the preserve with the first subtle lengthening of days that allowed the low sun to linger a fraction longer on the horizon, melting the surface crust of snow into a glistening sheen that refreezed each night into a hard shell bearing the weight of cautious footsteps without breaking through, the Scarecrow began to emerge once more from its deep winter tomb. Snow settling and sublimating around its base in imperceptible increments that revealed inch by inch the familiar post, and the lower folds of its coat crusted with the last rime of frost, straw inside thawing gradually in the weak warmth seeping through. Arms outstretched catching the pale light that filtered through thinning clouds promising the slow turn towards spring. A timeless figure bridging the endless cycle from deepest freeze to tentative renewal without haste or fanfare. And the community sensed the shift in the same gradual way. Windows cracked open briefly to let in air that carried the faint, clean scent of melting snow untainted by mud yet. Stoves banked lower as wood consumption eased with nights less biting. Mornings greeted with the distant drip of icicles hanging from eaves falling drop by drop into buckets placed to catch the rhythm that marked time better than clocks. Breakfasts lightening to toast, and jam spread thin because heavy foods lost appeal in the awakening appetite for change, however small, coffee still hot. But sipped facing windows cleared of frost with rags that left streaks drying slowly in the increasing light, and folded away the heaviest quilts storing them in chests with lavender sachets refreshed yearly. Blankets reduced layer by layer as rooms held warmth longer into the evenings. Needles set aside with projects completed or abandoned mid-row because outdoor air beckoned faintly, and Maya ordered seeds from catalogs dog-eared and annotated over winter. Packets arriving in plain envelopes opened with the same letter knife that slit them carefully. Contents spilled onto tables for sorting into envelopes labeled in fatting ink reused from previous years, and ventured outdoors more, shovel leaning against the porch unused as paths cleared themselves in the thaw. Instead checking sheds for tools that emerged from storage with handles cool to the touch, but warming in palms held longer. Gaze turning often to the Scarecrow reappearing like an old friend from beneath the receding white, its form a fixed point in the slowly shifting world. And afternoons brightened imperceptibly with sunlight slanting through bare branches, casting patterns on floors that shifted minute by minute inviting quiet observation from chairs pulled closer to windows. Naps shortening as energy returned with the promise of motion outdoors, bodies stretching in the mild air seeping through cracks sealed loosely now, and evenings lengthened with twilight lingering in soft grays that deepened gradually into night. Suppers of soups thinned with spring in mind eaten with windows open to hear the first tentative calls of returning birds testing the air. Dishes washed in water warming faster from taps no longer icy, then settling into chairs with lighter throws over laps. Radios or books chosen for the returning concentration as minds cleared from winter's fog, breaths evening out in the balanced temperature that neither chilled nor overheated, thoughts of folding and ordering and checking fatting like the last snow patches shrinking in shaded corners, pulling everything downward through gentle, renewing layers of seasonal transition where limbs relaxed fully and awareness softened at the edges. Sinking past the clearing view of the Scarecrow standing fully revealed once again under the emerging stars, past the endless fields slowly shedding their white cloak to reveal the dark earth beneath waiting patiently, into the deepest, most serene core of sleep, where the endless saga of the Scarecrow and the community dissolved into perfect harmony with the eternal cycles, the half-century argument long transformed into quiet acceptance. Mysteries of ancient mounds and forgotten truths resting undisturbed in the soothing rhythm of time that asked nothing and gave everything in its slow, unending flow, cradling body and soul, in profound, timeless peace, through the tranquil nights of early spring's quiet promise. This mysterious